Out here, beyond the marked trails and warning signs, there are things the public is never told about. I worked as a park ranger long enough to know that the forest doesn't just hide wildlife, it hides stories. Some of them are buried in old reports, others were never written down at all. Tonight, I'm sharing one of those stories. If you enjoy true feeling park ranger horror stories, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced something unsettling in the wilderness. Now, let me tell you what really happens after dark. I found the boots before I found the body, and even then, I never really found the body, just what was left behind when something decides you are finished being a person. They were wedged between two river stones like they'd been placed there deliberately. Toes pointing upstream, laces neatly tied. Ranger issue boots, same size as mine. Still damp, still warm enough that the frost hadn't settled into the leather yet, despite the temperature hovering just below freezing. The river around them moved slow and heavy, dark as oil, carrying a fine gray residue that clung to the rocks like soot. Ash. But there hadn't been a fire. Not here. Not anywhere in the district. I remember standing there longer than I should have, listening to the sound of water sliding over stone and thinking, not for the first time, that this job teaches you how to look at something horrible without reacting. You train yourself into stillness. You catalog, you rationalize, you tell yourself there will be paperwork later, and that thought becomes a sedative. I'd been a forest ranger for 17 years at that point. U.S. Forest Service, law enforcement track, search and rescue, recovery. I chose this job because it was supposed to make sense. Trails, boundaries, permits, weather systems, cause and effect. You get lost because you wander. You die because you fall or freeze or make a mistake. The wilderness is brutal, but it's honest. That belief carried me through the first decade. It did not survive the river. The official report would later state that Ranger Daniel H. Mercer went missing during a solo patrol and was presumed deceased due to environmental exposure. No foul play suspected, equipment recovered, case unresolved. That report is a lie, or at least it's missing the parts that matter. I was assigned to the northern sector that winter. A stretch of forest most people didn't even know existed because it sat between jurisdictions. National forest on paper, tribal land on the maps we weren't allowed to keep copies of, and something else that didn't have a designation at all. No trailheads, no signage, no visitors unless they were very, very lost. That was the appeal. Fewer people, fewer variables. The river cut through the sector like a scar, fed by snowmelt and underground springs that never froze completely. Locals avoided it, not superstitiously, not outwardly, but they wouldn't fish it, wouldn't camp near it, wouldn't answer questions about where it went if you followed it far enough north. It sinks, one of them told me once, an older man who smelled like wet iron and tobacco. Doesn't go anywhere people should. I laughed at the time, wrote it off as regional weirdness. Every place has its stories. The ash showed up 3 weeks before Mercer disappeared. At first, it was light enough to dismiss, a residue on the waterline, a fine gray film that smeared under your fingers like graphite. We ran checks for wildfire activity, illegal burns, distant industrial fallout, nothing. Air quality readings were clean. Satellite data showed no thermal anomalies within 300 miles. Then it started snowing ash instead of snow. Only along the river corridor. Only at night. I didn't see it fall. None of us did. You'd go out in the morning and find the ground dusted gray, every branch and stone coated like the aftermath of something catastrophic that somehow left no heat behind. The smell was wrong too, not wood smoke, not chemical. It smelled like burnt hair and wet stone, like something organic had been reduced too quickly. Mercer was the first to say it out loud. "This isn't right," he told me over the radio, his voice clipped but tight. "This isn't anything I've trained for." Mercer wasn't new. 12 years in, former military. He didn't spook easily. When he said something wasn't right, I listened. We started logging anomalies. That's the word we used. Anomalies feel manageable, temporary, solvable. The river level began to fluctuate without rain, dropping overnight, rising again by afternoon. We found animal tracks leading into the water that didn't come out the other side. Elk, deer, even a mountain lion once blight its prints clean and confident until they simply stopped at the riverbank, like the animal had stepped off the edge of the world. At night, the sound changed. I can't explain that part cleanly. Rivers are loud. You get used to them. White noise. But this was different. The current developed a rhythm that felt deliberate, like breathing, like something pacing beneath the surface, matching your steps when you walked along the bank. I started dreaming about the river weeks before Mercer vanished. In the dreams, it was dry, empty, a trench filled with ash so deep it reached my chest. I'd walk down into it, feeling the residue coat my tongue, my eyes, my lungs. I could hear voices beneath my boots, not screaming, not pleading, just talking, low and constant like a crowd in another room. I'd wake up with the taste of sulfur in my mouth and the sense that I'd been listening to something for a very long time. I didn't tell anyone. Rangers don't talk about dreams, not the kind that follow you into daylight. Mercer went missing on a routine patrol. No distress call, no gunfire, no signs of struggle. His GPS track ended at the river bend where I found the boots. The ash was thicker that morning. The water moved slower, burdened by it. When I leaned down, the surface reflected someone standing behind me, tall and narrow, shoulders wrong. But when I turned, there was only forest, pines spaced too evenly, no place for anyone to hide. I remember realizing then that the silence had weight, not quiet, compressed, like the air before a collapse. We searched for 3 days. Grid patterns, dogs, drones, nothing. No body, no blood, just the boots, his radio half buried in ash downstream, and the feeling that the forest was holding its breath, waiting for us to stop looking. On the 4th night, alone in my cabin, I heard Mercer's voice outside. Not on the radio. From the trees. He was calling my name the way he used to when we'd lose signal on patrol, calm, professional, like he was standing just out of sight and needed me to step closer to hear him clearly. I sat on my bunk, hands shaking around my flashlight, telling myself it was stress. Grief. Auditory hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and guilt. Then he laughed. It wasn't relief. It wasn't humor. It sounded like someone practicing the idea of laughter without understanding why humans do it. That was the moment I knew the river hadn't taken Mercer by accident, and that whatever lived there had learned how to use his voice. I didn't report the voice. That choice still sits in my chest like a lodged round. Every ranger is trained to escalate unexplained auditory contact immediately. Possible survivor, possible hostile, possible psychological stressor requiring relief from duty. I knew the protocol. I also knew what would happen if I followed it. They would send people. More people would hear it, and the forest would learn more voices. So I stayed quiet. The next morning, I told my supervisor I needed time in the field. Solo survey. River corridor. I framed it as closure. Unfinished business. He hesitated, but manpower was thin, and Mercer's disappearance had already attracted attention from agencies that don't like unanswered questions. The kind that come with clipboards and blank expressions and ask you to describe things using words that don't fit. By noon, I was walking north along the river, ash crunching faintly under my boots like powdered bone. The forest had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way you could photograph and prove, but in posture. Trees leaned subtly inward toward the water, their branches angled like listening ears. The air felt warmer near the riverbank, unnaturally so, while frost still clung to the shaded understory. Heat without source, another anomaly. I kept my radio off. The farther I followed the river, the less it behaved like water. The surface thickened, carrying the ash in slow, spiraling eddies that reminded me of fingerprints. Occasionally, bubbles rose, large, patient blisters that broke soundlessly and released a smell like rusted metal and decay. I passed the place where Mercer's GPS signal ended. Beyond it, the terrain dropped sharply. The river narrowed and vanished between stone walls streaked black, as if scorched long ago. No record of a burn. No record of anything here at all. This was where the map stopped agreeing. I should have turned back. That thought came fully formed and rational, like a final warning delivered politely. Instead, I felt something else push back against it, a pressure behind my eyes, a subtle certainty that if I left now, I wouldn't be allowed to come back. That this was a window, and it was already closing. The river disappeared into the rock. Not underground, not fully. It slid beneath an overhang and continued through a fissure wide enough for a person to crouch through. The ash thinned here, clinging to the stone like a residue left by receding tide. Someone had been here recently. Boot prints, ranger issue tread, Mercer's. They didn't show signs of struggle, no skid marks, no hesitation, just a steady progression forward deeper into I followed. The temperature shifted immediately. Cold, dense, pressing inward. My breath fogged, but the fog didn't rise. It sank, pooling near the ground like it was being pulled somewhere lower. The sound changed too. The river no longer flowed. It whispered. Not language, not exactly, but cadence, a murmur that suggested conversation without meaning. My flashlight beam cut across stone walls etched with marks that looked like tool scars until you stared too long and realized they followed no functional pattern. Spirals, repeated arcs, the same shapes over and over, carved deep and then worn smooth by time or touch. The deeper I went, the more I smelled ash and wet fur. The tunnel widened suddenly into a cavern so large my light couldn't find the ceiling. The river pooled here, black and still, its surface coated thick with gray. In the center of the pool stood something that made my stomach drop, not from fear but recognition, a fire pit. Old, carefully constructed, stones stacked with intention. But there was no charring, no soot, no heat damage, just ash. An impossible amount of it, piled high, spilling into the water, and around it, boots. Dozens of them, different sizes, different brands, some military, some civilian, some so old the leather had cracked and fused with the stone. All empty, all positioned neatly facing inward toward the pit like an audience waiting for something to begin. My legs went weak. I had to sit down before I fell. This wasn't a kill site. It wasn't chaos. It was ritualized, controlled. That was when I noticed the wall behind the pit. It wasn't stone, it was metal. A massive curved surface half buried in rock. Its edges sealed into the cavern like it had been installed before the earth closed around it. No markings, no rust, no visible seams except one. A vertical line running down the center, just wide enough for fingers to fit inside. A door, the whispering intensified, not louder, closer. It pressed against my ears from inside my skull. I felt vibrations through the stone beneath my palms, rhythmic and slow, like something massive shifting its weight. I told myself it was an abandoned bunker, Cold War relic, black site, something buried and forgotten. But bunkers don't breathe. The door trembled. Ash slid from its surface in soft cascades as the seam widened. The sound it made was wrong, organic, wet, like cartilage parting. Something inside exhaled. The air rushed past me, hot and foul, carrying the unmistakable stench of decay layered over something else, something sterile, chemical, clean. The smell of a place that had been sealed too long and opened too late. A shape moved in the gap, not stepping out, not yet, just adjusting like a body stretching after a long confinement. And then it spoke. Not aloud. Inside me. Not words, memories. Mercer's laugh. The exact cadence. My mother calling me in for dinner when I was 8. The sound of a man screaming underwater during a recovery. I never filed properly because the body had been too damaged to identify and the family didn't need details. Every voice it used was one I recognized. Every memory came with the certainty that it had been taken, not imagined. I crawled backwards, slipping in ash, my heart trying to break free of my ribs. The cavern seemed to contract, stone walls creeping inward, boots scraping softly as if adjusting their attention toward me. The door opened wider. Something reached out. Not a limb, not fully, just pressure. A presence that pressed against my chest, invisible and heavy, pinning me in place. My lungs burned. Frost formed on my eyelashes while sweat soaked my back. It wanted me to step forward, to leave my boots, to add my voice to the collection. I don't remember screaming. I remember biting down so hard my teeth cracked. Pain cut through the pressure just enough for me to move. I fired my weapon, not at the thing, but at the ceiling. Stone collapsed. Dust filled the air. The presence recoiled, more surprised than hurt. I ran. Behind me, the whispering rose, not angry, hungry. And beneath it all, the river began to move again. I don't remember how long I ran. Time fractured the moment I left the cavern, splitting into useless pieces that refused to line up again. My body took over. Training, muscle memory, panic, stripped of thought. I scraped through the fissure, tore skin from my palms, slammed my shoulder hard enough to numb my arm, and burst back into the open forest, choking on cold air that tasted suddenly thin and unreal. The river roared behind me, not louder, closer, as if the sound itself was pursuing me, keeping pace just beyond my hearing. I didn't look back. I knew better. Predators exploit the turn of the head. So do worse things. I ran until my lungs felt lined with glass and my legs betrayed me, pitching me face first into the ash-stained snow. I lay there, cheek pressed into the ground, expecting pressure on my back, weight, that invisible crushing presence returning to finish what it had started. Nothing came. The forest had gone silent. Not the natural quiet of snowfall or windless cold. This was an absence. No insects, no distant water, no birds. Even my own breathing sounded foreign, too loud, like I was intruding on something private. When I finally pushed myself up, the landscape looked wrong. The trees were the same species, the same spacing, but they were older, thicker, bark split and scarred in ways that take centuries. The river was gone entirely. No sound, no channel. Just a shallow depression filled with ash that drifted lazily in the air like falling spores. I checked my GPS. No signal. Not even the error message. Just a frozen screen showing coordinates that didn't correspond to anything on my maps. The compass spun uselessly, needle shivering like it couldn't decide which direction deserved to exist. That was when I noticed the footprints. Mine, leading away from the cavern, and another set beside them. Same stride length, same tread, perfectly synchronized. I turned slowly, nothing behind me. But when I looked back down, the second set of prints had stopped, ending abruptly, toes pointed toward mine, as if whoever had been walking with me had simply decided to stand still and watch. A pressure built behind my eyes again. Not pain, familiarity. The sense of being gently guided toward a conclusion already agreed upon. I told myself to keep moving. I said it out loud, forcing sound into the dead air. Just keep moving. My voice came back wrong, not echoed, returned, flattened, stripped of tone, as if the forest had repeated the words without understanding why they mattered. I walked for hours, maybe days. The sun never moved. Frozen low in the sky, casting long shadows that didn't match my movements. Sometimes I thought I saw figures standing just inside the tree line, too tall, too still. But when I focused on them, they resolved into dead trunks or stone. Other times, they didn't resolve at all. I found structures as the terrain sloped upward. Ruins at first, rotted cabins, collapsed sheds, the remains of a logging camp that had never made it into the records. Tools lay scattered where they'd been dropped. Metal eaten thin by rust, handles worn smooth by hands that had used them for years and then never came back. In one cabin, I found a journal. The pages were brittle, ink faded but legible. Written by a ranger. Not Mercer. Older. Dated decades before I was born. He described the river, the ash, the voices. He wrote about a containment site sealed beneath the land, about agreements made quietly, about the need for offerings to keep it dormant. The last entry was short. It apologized. I burned the journal instinctively, then realized my mistake as soon as the flame touched paper. The fire made no heat. The pages blackened instantly, crumbling into ash that lifted eagerly from the pit and drifted toward the shallow depression where the river should have been. The ash moved with purpose, as if responding to a call I couldn't hear. I backed away, heart hammering. That was when the radio turned on. Static at first, then a voice. My supervisor. Calling my name, using my call sign. Asking for a status check. Irritation bleeding through professional calm. I fell to my knees, clutching the radio like it was a lifeline. "I'm here," I said. "I'm still here." A pause. Then, "You shouldn't have gone past the markers." "What markers?" I demanded. Another pause. Longer. "You know the ones," he said carefully. "The places that don't want to be found." The transmission crackled, distorted. For a moment, his voice overlapped with Mercer's, the two blending seamlessly, same cadence, same breath. "They need witnesses," the voice said. "They need voices that remember how to be human." The ground beneath me vibrated, not violently, patiently. I felt it then, something moving far below, repositioning itself, aligning with my location. The same crushing presence from the cavern brushed my chest again, lighter this time, almost affectionate. A reminder I understood in that moment what the river was, not a feature, a boundary, a drain. It carried away what was left after the thing beneath the land finished with you. Ash was all that remained when memory, voice, and identity were stripped clean and stored somewhere deeper. The forest wasn't hiding it, it was built around it. I ran again, this time uphill, toward a ridgeline I recognized dimly from patrol maps that no longer applied. My body screamed, my vision tunneled. I could hear footsteps behind me now, not matching mine anymore, but adjusting, learning. Voices layered over each other, calling my name with increasing confidence. I broke through the tree line onto bare rock just as the ground split open behind me, a fissure tearing through soil and stone like a mouth opening too wide. Heat rolled out, carrying the stink of decay and metal and something clean enough to be surgical. I didn't look down. I jumped. The fall should have killed me. It didn't. I landed hard in freezing water, shock tearing a scream from my throat as the river, real this time, violently cold, dragged me under and hurled me downstream. When I surfaced, gasping, the ash was gone. The forest looked normal. The sun moved again. Search teams found me 2 days later, miles south, delirious and hypothermic. They asked questions. I answered some of them. They told me Mercer's boots had washed away. They told me the river tested clean. They told me there was no record of any bunker, any sealed site, any agreements. They told me I was lucky. I resigned 6 months later. I don't go near forests anymore. But sometimes at night I hear a river where there shouldn't be one. And beneath the sound of water, something practicing how to laugh. I tried to disappear after that. Not dramatically. No manifesto. No drinking myself into an early grave. I moved inland. Took a job that kept me inside concrete buildings with fluorescent lights and predictable acoustics. Paperwork, training manuals, risk assessment, the kind of work that lets you pretend the world is governed by checklists and liability waivers. For a while, it worked. Then the reports started crossing my desk. They came from other districts, other states, different terrain entirely. Deserts where rivers shouldn't exist. Frozen lakes that thawed overnight without temperature change, canyons where ash accumulated despite no burn history. Always the same pattern, missing personnel, missing hikers, missing locals who knew better. Equipment recovered, boots, radios, sometimes journals, always unresolved. The language was familiar, too familiar. Environmental exposure, disorientation, presumed deceased. The same careful phrasing designed to close a file without ever answering it. I told myself it was coincidence, confirmation bias, trauma looking for patterns. Then I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a river bend, ash on the banks, my boots at the edge of the frame, taken from behind me. The timestamp was 3 days earlier. I hadn't been near a forest in over a year. That was when I stopped sleeping. Because when I did sleep, I dreamed of doors. Not the bunker door, not exactly. Variations of it. Seams in places they shouldn't be, elevator walls that breathed, storm drains humming with restrained patience. In every dream, something waited on the other side, not rushing, not angry, just certain I would open it eventually. And sometimes I did. I started hearing things again, not voices at first. Rhythms, cadences embedded in everyday noise, the hum of HVAC systems aligning into patterns. The rush of traffic sounding too much like water moving through stone. Once, in a crowded grocery store, I caught the scent of burnt hair and wet fur and had to abandon my cart before my knees gave out. I went back to my old supervisor. He'd aged fast. Gray threaded through his hair like frost. When I asked him directly what we'd built the forests around, his jaw tightened in a way that told me he'd been waiting for the question. "We didn't build it," he said. "We inherited it." He told me there were places the land didn't want witnesses, places that learned from us, mimicked us, needed us the way a fire needs fuel, but more selectively. Voices, memories, familiarity. It fed on recognition. I asked him why they kept sending people anyway. Because it doesn't stay contained on its own, he said, and because it doesn't hunt, it waits. He slid a file across the desk. Inside were maps I'd never seen, layers stripped away, boundaries redrawn not by ownership but by behavior, rivers that didn't connect, valleys where sound bent inward, sites marked only with dates and numbers, intervals, cycles. "You broke one," he said quietly, "by getting out." That night I understood the final truth. It wasn't following me. It was using me. The dreams weren't invitations. They were rehearsals. Each time I remembered it, each time I spoke about it, even now, I gave it shape, presence, continuity. It existed in the gaps between witness and silence, and I was no longer silent. That's why I'm recording this, not as a warning. Warnings assume choice. This is a confession. There are places in this country that are not wilderness. They are structures older than our maps, older than our languages. They collect us the way sediment collects at the bottom of a river, slowly, inevitably, until pressure demands release. If you hear a voice in the forest using someone you trust, do not answer. If you find ash where there has been no fire, turn around. If you see a door where there should only be stone, leave your boots where they are and run while you still remember why that matters. Because the land remembers every scream, and eventually it learns how to make them sound like home. I still wake up choking on pine smoke that isn't there, hearing my own name carried on a wind that hasn't touched my face in years. I was a forest ranger for 12 seasons, long enough to learn the difference between silence and the kind of quiet that presses against your skull like a held breath. Long enough to watch good people vanish without a trace and be told politely to stop asking why. Long enough to know that the wilderness doesn't just kill. Sometimes it keeps. I'm recording this because my hands won't stop shaking when I try to write it down, because I don't trust my memory anymore, because there are things I heard, things that followed me home, and if I don't say them out loud, I'm afraid they'll keep growing in the dark. I didn't choose this job because I love trees. I chose it because I wanted distance. Distance from a life I'd already failed at. Distance from a search and rescue call early in my career that still shows up in my dreams. A teenage hiker named Evan Cross, missing for 6 days in late October. We found his pack near a dry creek bed. We found his boots neatly placed side by side, toes pointing north. We never found Evan. I signed the report. Exposure. Likely fall. Probable animal activity. All the words we use when the truth won't sit still long enough to be written. After that, I learned how to compartmentalize. How to keep my radio chatter calm while my gut twisted. How to tell families we'd done everything we could while knowing the land hadn't given us permission to look everywhere. The district I was assigned to later wasn't famous. No postcard overlooks, no named legends. Just miles of mixed forest, broken ridgelines, old logging roads that led nowhere, and a scattering of abandoned mining claims from a century ago. Most of them collapsed, some of them sealed with warning signs no one remembered posting. It was the kind of place where the wind didn't just move through the trees, it moved between them, slipping through spaces that felt too narrow for air alone. The first report came in late summer. A hiker called from the southern boundary, voice tight, breathless. He said he could hear people talking under his feet. Not echoes, not animals, voices. Clear enough to make out words if he pressed his ear to the ground. I told him to stay put. Told him it was probably wind through old root systems or shifting shale. I'd heard stranger things explained away with less effort. When I reached him, he was sitting on a rock with his boots off, socks soaked dark with sweat. He kept pressing his heel into the dirt like he was trying to feel a pulse, "They're not down there anymore," he said before I could speak. "They moved when you got close." I laughed, a reflex, the kind you use to reassure someone without lying outright. The wind picked up then, warm, wrong for that time of year, and for just a second I thought I heard my name carried on it. Not shouted, spoken, casual, familiar. I didn't tell him that part. I logged the incident as stress-induced auditory hallucination. Dehydration, anxiety. I told myself the same thing for weeks. Then the calls started coming from deeper in the forest. A solo camper who swore her dead brother was calling to her from the tree line at night. A hunter who said something followed him for 3 miles, matching his pace, always just out of sight, breathing too evenly to be human. A maintenance worker who quit on the spot after hearing laughter inside a sealed culvert, laughter that stopped the moment he looked directly at it. I responded to most of them alone. Budget cuts, staffing shortages, the usual excuses that get people killed quietly. Every time I arrived to find the same thing: disturbed ground, scuffed earth where someone had stood too long in one place, and the smell. Not rot, not decay, something cleaner, like rain hitting hot metal, like burnt hair carried on a summer breeze. The wind became a character in my days. It learned my schedule, rose when I stopped, died when I listened. It carried sounds that didn't belong to the forest, footsteps where there were no prints, murmured conversations that fell apart when I tried to focus on them. At night in my cabin, the temperature would spike without warning, sweat soaking my sheets while frost crept across the inside of the windows. I'd lie there, heart pounding, convinced something was standing just outside, breathing through the thin walls, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I didn't tell anyone. Rangers aren't supposed to spook easily. We're supposed to be the calm ones, the rational ones, the ones who explain away the unexplainable so tourists can sleep in their tents without wondering what's listening. The guilt started creeping back then. Evan's boots. The way they'd been placed so carefully. The way the wind that day had carried his mother's voice across the search grid when she wasn't anywhere near us. I started hearing him too. Not constantly, just enough to doubt myself. Just enough to make me stop in the middle of patrol and turn around, radio raised, asking for a response that never came. The breaking point, the moment I can't rewind past, came with a call marked restricted. No public access, no civilian report, just a directive to investigate a sensor anomaly near an old mining corridor we weren't supposed to acknowledge existed. The file was thin, coordinates, a note about acoustic irregularities, a reminder to log nothing digitally. When I drove out there, the road vanished under my tires, asphalt to gravel to dirt to something that felt more like memory than ground. The trees pressed in close, trunks too narrow to hide anything, yet I kept catching movement between them, shadows that shifted when I stared directly at them. The air smelled metallic, ozone and wet stone. My radio hissed with overlapping voices, none of them on my channel, all of them speaking at once in tones that made my teeth ache. I parked at the edge of a clearing that wasn't on any map. In the center was a depression in the earth, ringed with old warning markers half swallowed by soil. The wind poured out of it like breath from a lung, warm and steady, carrying with it the sound of people talking far, far below. And one of those voices, clearer than the rest, said my name the way Evan used to, when he wanted help and didn't want to sound scared. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough for the ground beneath my boots to start vibrating, subtle at first, like distant machinery. Long enough for the wind to die completely, cutting off the voices mid-sentence, leaving a silence so complete it rang. That was when I realized I wasn't alone in the clearing. Something brushed my ankle. Light. Curious. Cold. I didn't look down because every instinct I had told me that whatever touched me was waiting for that acknowledgement. Like a game where eye contact was consent. I stepped back instead. Slow. Deliberate. Ranger training drilled that into us. Don't run unless you have to. Don't escalate an unknown. My boots scraped stone that shouldn't have been there. The ground was no longer soft soil, but something packed and smooth, like a floor worn down by traffic over decades. The vibration intensified, not shaking, thrumming. A low-frequency pressure that crept up through my legs and settled behind my eyes. My vision blurred at the edges, darkening like a vignette closing in. "Control, this is Ranger Hale," I said into my radio, forcing my voice steady. "I'm at the anomaly site, requesting confirmation of backup ETA." Static answered. Then, faint, almost shy, my own voice repeated the transmission back to me. Same cadence, same breath. Just a half-second delayed, warped like it had passed through a long tunnel. I lowered the radio. The depression in the clearing was wider than I'd first thought. The soil sloped inward, forming a shallow bowl that funneled toward a rectangular outline in the center. A hatch. Metal oxidized to a dull green-brown, edges sealed with concrete that had cracked like old bone. No markings, no serial numbers, no warning labels, just a handle, worn smooth. The smell intensified as I approached, that clean burned scent again, mixed now with damp fur and something sweetly rotten underneath. My stomach clenched with a memory I didn't want. Evan's pack, opened and empty, smelling wrong for something that had supposedly been out in the elements for days. The wind returned in a rush as my shadow crossed the hatch. Voices surged up from below, overlapping, urgent, some pleading, some laughing, some just breathing. The sound crawled under my skin, setting my nerves on fire, and threaded through all of it was a pattern, a rhythm, like a crowd rehearsing the same sentence over and over, never quite getting it right. I told myself it was an abandoned ventilation shaft, old mining infrastructure tied into a decommissioned facility, government leftovers buried and forgotten. I told myself there was an explanation because the alternative, because believing what my body already knew, would mean admitting I'd been standing on the mouth of something that had been listening to me my entire career. I knelt and placed my palm against the hatch. It was warm, not sun-warmed. Alive warm. The vibration intensified, syncing with my pulse until I couldn't tell where I ended, and it began. Images flashed unbidden behind my eyes. Corridors stretching impossibly long, walls sweating moisture, figures standing just out of reach of the light, their faces wrong in subtle ways that made my chest tighten. I pulled my hand back with a sharp inhale. The voices stopped instantly. No echo, no fade. Just gone. The silence that followed was heavier than sound. It pressed against my ears until they rang. I realized then that the forest around the clearing had gone completely still. No insects, no birds. Even the leaves had frozen mid-rustle, suspended as if the world was holding its breath with me. Something shifted behind me. I turned, heart hammering, hand on my sidearm. The clearing was empty, too empty. The shadows between the trees were wrong, too deep, too uniform, like holes cut into reality. And in one of them I saw movement not within the darkness, but of it. A silhouette peeling itself free from shadow, stretching into a shape that suggested a person without committing to one. I blinked. It didn't disappear. It stood there, motionless at the edge of the tree line. No features. No eyes I could see, just the suggestion of shoulders, a head tilted slightly as if listening. I raised my weapon. "Identify yourself," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. The thing leaned forward an inch and spoke. Not aloud, not exactly. The sound bloomed inside my skull, intimate and invasive, if using a voice I hadn't heard in years. "You didn't look for me long enough." "Evan." I staggered back, heel catching on uneven ground. The vibration surged, knocking the breath from my lungs. The hatch rattled beneath me, concrete cracking further, dust puffing up in small, choking clouds. The silhouette took a step closer. Its footfall made no sound. I fired. The shot rang out deafeningly loud in the frozen air. The recoil jolted my arm, grounding me just enough to stay upright. The bullet punched through the shadow and buried itself in a tree trunk behind it, splinters exploding outward. The thing didn't react. It simply reassembled. The hole where the bullet passed through folded in on itself, darkness knitting together like flesh. Then it smiled. I know that sounds impossible. There was no face, no mouth, but the curve of its posture changed, conveying satisfaction so clearly my stomach dropped. The wind roared back to life, tearing through the clearing with enough force to make me stumble. Voices poured out of the hatch again. Louder now, more organized. Chanting. Not words I recognized, but structured, intentional. A sound meant to be followed. The ground beneath my feet sloped sharply. The bowl was deepening, soil collapsing inward as if the earth itself was tired of pretending it was solid. I scrambled uphill, boots sliding, grabbing at roots that tore free in my hands. Something brushed my ankle again, firmer this time. Fingers? Tendrils? I kicked reflexively, connecting with nothing but cold pressure that lingered like a bruise. The silhouette moved closer without moving, distance folding in on itself. I could feel its attention like a weight on my chest, compressing my lungs. "You don't belong here," I shouted, the words feeling laughably inadequate. The reply came from everywhere at once, from the trees, the ground, the hatch, the space behind my eyes. "Neither do you." I broke then. Training be damned, I ran. I don't remember making it back to my truck. I remember branches tearing at my uniform, the forest blurring into a tunnel of green and shadow. I remember the sound of footsteps matching mine exactly. No matter how fast I went, no matter how abruptly I changed direction. When I reached the road, my truck was there, but wrong. The doors were open. The interior light glowed weakly, muttered flickering like a failing heartbeat. And from inside, the radio crackled to life, my own voice speaking calmly into the void. "Control, this is Ranger Hale. I've located the source. It wants to be found." I slammed the door shut and tore away from the clearing, gravel spraying. The wind followed me for miles, whispering through the open windows, carrying fragments of conversations I couldn't piece together. Names, dates, coordinates that made my head throb. I reported nothing when I got back. I filed a maintenance note about sensor interference. I avoided that sector like it was cursed ground, which, in retrospect, might have been the most honest thing I did. But the forest didn't forget me. At night, I started hearing the chanting again, muffled, like it was coming from beneath my cabin, from beneath the town. I'd wake to find dirt under my fingernails, boots by the door caked in mud I couldn't place. And sometimes, just before dawn, I'd hear the wind outside my window carrying voices from miles away, all of them speaking at once, all of them saying the same thing in Evan's voice. "You're standing on it again." I tried to pretend it was sleepwalking, stress response, a mind reaching for familiar patterns to explain behavior I couldn't remember initiating. Rangers disappear into work the same way others disappear into bottles or pills. I told myself this was no different. That lie lasted until I found the map. It was spread across my kitchen table one morning, weighed down at the corners with rocks I didn't own. A district map. Old edition, the kind we stopped using years ago because the boundaries kept changing after the land was rezoned, restricted, reclassified. Someone had drawn over it in charcoal, thick, obsessive lines circling a region that wasn't labeled at all. No forest name, no access roads, just a blank space the size of a town. At the center of it, a symbol I didn't recognize, a square inside a circle. The same shape as the hatch. My hands started shaking before my mind caught up. I don't remember drawing it. I don't remember bringing the map home. I don't remember owning charcoal. The smell came back then. Burnt hair, damp stone. It seeped into the room like fog, clinging to the curtains, the couch, the inside of my throat. I gagged, backed away from the table, and knocked over one of the rocks. It hit the floor with a hollow metallic clang. I picked it up. It wasn't a rock. It was a chunk of concrete, edges worn smooth, with a faint impression pressed into one side. Letters. Partial. Like something that had once been stamped there and then erased by time or intent. I could make out 3 of them. Ter shelter. Bunker. Center. I dropped it like it burned. That was the day I started checking under the floorboards. My cabin was government issued, built fast decades ago, and maintained only when something visibly broke. I'd never questioned the slight unevenness of the floors by the way the air vents hummed even when the system was off. Lots of old structures do that. Wood expands, pipes shift. But when I pressed my ear to the floor, holding my breath, I heard it. Not chanting, not voices. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Patient. As if something enormous was sleeping beneath me, its chest rising and falling just out of reach. I moved out that night. I told my supervisor I needed medical leave. I didn't tell him why. He didn't ask. He wouldn't meet my eyes when he signed the paperwork, just slid it across the desk with a look I'd seen before. On families we couldn't help, on rangers who transferred suddenly, on men who learned too much, found reasons to disappear quietly. I drove until the forest thinned into scrubland, then desert. Heat shimmered off the asphalt. The radio stayed off. I couldn't risk hearing myself talk back again. For a while, it worked. The wind was just wind. The ground was just ground. I slept through the night without waking to dirt-stained hands or phantom vibrations. Then the dreams started. I was underground every time. Corridors branching endlessly, walls lined with doors that pulsed faintly like veins beneath skin. I'd hear people talking behind them, some crying, some laughing, some calmly explaining things to no one. When I opened a door, there was never a body inside. Just impressions. Boot prints in dust that didn't belong to me. Handprints pressed into concrete from the inside. In one dream, I followed the sound of Evan's voice down a sloping tunnel until it opened into a vast chamber. The ceiling disappeared into darkness. The floor was covered in soil, churned and packed flat by countless footsteps. Figures stood there, dozens of them, hundreds. They didn't move. They didn't need to. The moment I stepped inside, they all turned their heads in perfect unison. I woke up screaming in a motel room 3 states away, the smell of wet fur thick in the air. The final call came 2 weeks later. Blocked number, no introduction, just coordinates spoken in a flat, practiced voice. The same voice I'd heard in my radio that day in the clearing, mine, but stripped of inflection. "You logged the first contact," it said. "You're required to witness the closure." "I'm not a ranger anymore," I said, my mouth dry. A pause. Then, gently, "Neither were the others." The line went dead. I didn't go back because I wanted answers. I went back because something in me knew I already belonged to that place, and running was only stretching the distance it would eventually close. The coordinates led me deeper than before, past the clearing, past any road I recognized. The forest grew denser, older. Trees twisted in on themselves, bark scarred with marks that looked too deliberate to be natural. The air grew colder with every step, frost forming on leaves despite the summer heat. I found the entrance at dusk, not the hatch. A tunnel mouth carved into the side of a ravine, concealed by brush that parted when I approached like it recognized me. No warning signs, no fence. Just darkness exhaling warm, damp air that smelled of stone and blood and memory. There were footprints leading inside. Fresh. Human. I followed them because that's what I've always done, because that's what they trained me to do. Because somewhere along the way, the distinction between duty and compulsion eroded completely. The tunnel sloped downward, walls reinforced with rusted metal beams stamped with insignias I didn't recognize. My flashlight beam shook as it passed over numbers painted on the walls. Levels, maybe, or dates. Some were scratched out violently, replaced with tally marks that climbed higher the deeper I went. The sound started halfway down, wind but not moving air, something simulating it. Carrying voices that overlapped and separated, testing combinations, practicing tones. I heard a woman crying for her son. A man calmly reciting his social security number. A ranger calling in a status update that cut off mid-sentence. And beneath all of it, a low hum that vibrated through my bones, tuning me like an instrument. The tunnel opened into a bunker, concrete walls, industrial lighting, most of it dead. Rows of sealed doors lining the perimeter, each marked with the same square inside circle symbol. The floor was scarred with drag marks, stains scrubbed too clean to hide what they'd been. In the center of the room was a pit, and standing at its edge were 3 figures in ranger uniforms. Their backs were to me. I recognized the names stitched onto their shoulders. Men I'd worked with. Men who'd transferred. Retired, gone missing. One of them turned his head slowly. His face was wrong. Not distorted, not monstrous, just unfinished. Like something had learned the structure of a human face, but not the purpose behind it. "You're late," he said, in my voice. From the pit below came the sound of wind rushing upward, carrying voices from miles away, all of them calling my name with growing certainty. I stepped forward before I realized I was moving. The bunker doors began to open one by one. The doors didn't swing open all at once. That would have been merciful. Instead, they peeled back slowly, metal shrieking softly as seals that hadn't been broken in decades gave way. The sound reminded me of something breathing through clenched teeth. Inside each room was light, not bulbs, not fixtures. A pale, ambient glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. As the doors opened, the voices grew clearer, more distinct, peeling away from the collective murmur into individual threads. I heard names I hadn't thought about in years. Rangers, locals, hikers, a dispatcher who'd retired early after a breakdown, a volunteer who'd vanished during a winter search. They weren't screaming. That was the worst part. They were talking, conversational, calm, as if they were being interviewed or rehearsing something they'd already said many times before. One of the figures, not a man anymore, no matter how much he resembled one, gestured toward the pit. "You were always good at listening," it said. "That's why it stayed with you." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, to insist this was a facility, an experiment, a mass grave with bad acoustics and worse oversight. But my body remembered before my mind could lie. The hum beneath the voices wasn't machinery. It wasn't power. It was resonance. Something vast below us was responding to sound the way a throat responds to breath. I stepped closer to the pit despite myself. The air above it shimmered, warping light like heat over asphalt. When I leaned forward, the smell hit me full force. Wet fur, copper, ozone, and that clean burned scent again, so strong it made my eyes water. The pit wasn't empty. Its walls dropped straight down for maybe 20 feet before widening into a cavernous space I couldn't fully see. The floor below was covered in soil, dark, churned, packed flat by countless feet. And rising from that soil were shapes, not bodies, columns, growths, pillars of something fibrous and dark, branching upward and outward, disappearing into the ceiling's shadow. They pulsed gently, expanding and contracting in time with the hum. Embedded along them were impressions, faces, not preserved, not sculpted, pressed outward from within, as if something on the inside was pushing through, testing the boundary, eyes closed, mouths open mid-sentence, some familiar, some mercifully not. The voices were coming from there, from inside, whatever that was. "It doesn't kill," one of the figures said, stepping beside me. "It records." I turned to him. His features shifted subtly as I looked, nose lengthening, jaw narrowing. My attention was stabilizing the shape he'd chosen. "Why?" I asked. My voice sounded small in that space. A pause. Then, because nothing else listens long enough. The bunker lights flickered. Somewhere deep below, something adjusted, the hum dipping into a frequency that made my knees buckle. The figures steadied me with hands that felt wrong, too cool, pressure without warmth. "You hear it now," another said. "The wind, the ground, the spaces between places. You always did." Memory crashed over me in fragments. Evan's boots placed neatly by the creek. The way the wind had carried his mother's voice across the search grid. The hikers who heard people talking beneath their feet. The laughter in the culvert. It hadn't started here. This was just where it gathered. "It's old," the first figure continued. "Older than the forest. Older than the names you give land so you can pretend it belongs to you. We didn't build this place. We found where it surfaced." "And fed it," I said. Something like approval rippled through the room. "We gave it structure," he corrected, "so it wouldn't wander." A door behind me slammed shut. Then another. The bunker sealed itself with a finality that echoed in my chest. The pit's glow intensified, casting long, writhing shadows that didn't line up with the shapes creating them. The voices shifted. They began to synchronize. Hundreds of individual tones aligning into a single cadence, rising and falling together. Words emerged, not English, not any language I recognized, but I understood them anyway, the meaning pressing directly into my thoughts. Witness. The figures stepped back in unison. I realized then that they weren't guards. They were anchors. The floor beneath my boots vibrated violently. Cracks spiderwebbed outward from the pit's edge. The pillars below swelled, expanding, their surfaces rippling as more faces pressed outward, straining against whatever thin barrier held them inside. The air grew hot, then cold. Frost raced across the concrete even as sweat soaked through my clothes. My chest tightened under an invisible weight, breath coming shallow and fast. "You logged the first contact," the voice said gently. "Now you complete it." The pit called to me, not with words, with memory, with guilt, with every unanswered question I'd ever carried into the woods and buried under procedure and paperwork. I saw Evan standing at the edge, just as he'd looked the day we found his boots, mud-streaked, exhausted, hope flickering weakly behind his eyes. "You left me," he said, not accusing, just stating fact. "I didn't know," I whispered. "You heard me," he replied. My foot slid forward. I don't remember deciding to jump. I remember falling. The air thickened as I dropped, slowing me, cushioning the descent like a lung drawing breath. I passed through layers of sound, voices stacked atop voices, each one brushing against me, imprinting memories that weren't mine. Last thoughts. Regrets. Final moments stretched out and preserved. I landed on the soil without pain. Up close, the pillars weren't solid. They were composed of countless intertwined filaments, vibrating softly, each one carrying a voice. When I touched one, it responded instantly, sound surging through it and into me. I screamed, not from fear, from overload. The chorus poured into my skull, every scream swallowed by the woods, every name called into the wind and never answered. The land remembered them all. It kept them, just as it had kept Evan, just as it had kept the others. And now it was keeping me. The soil shifted beneath my feet, shaping itself, guiding me toward the center where the hum was strongest, where the resonance peaked into something almost satisfied. Above, I heard the bunker doors opening again. New footsteps, new voices, the cycle continuing. As the filaments began to wrap around my legs, cool and gentle, I understood the final truth they never wrote in reports. Some disappearances aren't accidents, some aren't crimes, some are additions. The wind surged upward through the pit, carrying voices from miles away, carrying mine with them, learning it, practicing it, preparing to use it when the next one came close enough to listen. This recording ends here because the rest isn't meant for you. If you're hearing this and the wind has started to sound like someone you know, it's already too late. A storm front stopped exactly at the park border. The storm should have swallowed us whole, but instead it stopped at an invisible line in the dirt, like the forest itself had raised a hand and said, "No farther." My name doesn't matter much anymore, but I'll give you enough to know who I was before the woods rewrote me. I was 38 when this happened, old enough to trust my judgment, young enough to still believe in the rules. I'd been a forest ranger for over a decade, stationed in a national forest that stretches across state lines and disappears into high country most people only see from airplanes. Locals called it stubborn land. The old-timers said weather behaved strangely there, like it was listening to something deeper than barometric pressure. I used to laugh at that. Weather follows physics. Forests follow maps. Fear follows imagination. That's what I told myself. The storm rolled in fast that afternoon, a hard shelf of black cloud bruising the horizon. Thunder growled low and patient, the kind that doesn't waste energy. I was finishing a routine patrol along the southern boundary, checking trailheads and making sure a group of college kids had actually cleared out like they promised. My radio crackled with updates from stations outside the park. Flash flood warnings, wind advisories, a line of severe weather marching east. But inside the park, the air was wrong. Still. Too still. No wind to stir the needles on the pines, no birds flushing ahead of the pressure drop. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. When the rain finally came, it fell hard, cold, and straight down. I watched it from the cab of my truck as it hit the boundary sign. The rain hammered the dirt road beyond the sign, turned it to mud in seconds, but on my side, the ground stayed dry. Not damp, dry. I got out, held my hand past the sign. Rain soaked my sleeve, pulled it back. Nothing. The storm stood there, roaring and flashing, but it wouldn't cross. I should have reported it. I should have turned around and gone back to the station. Instead, I stood there too long, staring at that invisible wall, trying to fit it into a shape my mind recognized. The forest was quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. No insects, no wind, just my own breathing, suddenly loud. That was the first time the forest made me feel like a trespasser. The next call came an hour later. A hiker hadn't checked in at a backcountry permit box near the old limestone caves in the northern sector. Solo male, mid-40s, experienced, the kind that thinks preparation makes you immune to accidents. I'd done rescues near those caves before. Twisting systems, cold air that rolls out of them even in summer, stories from locals about voices echoing where they shouldn't. Sound plays tricks underground. I knew that. I told myself that as I drove. By the time I reached the trailhead, the storm still raged outside the park. I could see lightning fork and split beyond the trees, hear thunder roll like distant artillery. Inside, the sky above the canopy was clear. Too clear. The temperature dropped sharply as I hiked in, breath fogging like I'd crossed into a different season. I found the hiker's pack near the cave entrance, neatly set down, boots aligned beside it. No signs of a struggle. That bothered me more than blood ever could. People don't undress themselves for accidents. They don't lay their lives out carefully before vanishing. I called his name. My voice came back wrong, not an echo, a delay like the cave was thinking about it before answering. I stepped inside, my headlamp cutting a narrow tunnel through the dark. The air smelled damp and mineral-rich, with an undernote I couldn't place. Not rot, not animal, something older, colder. That's when I heard it. A knock. 3 slow taps spaced evenly coming from deeper in the cave. Not a rock fall. Too deliberate. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. My first instinct was denial. Caves settle. Water drips. Your mind fills gaps. I followed the sound, each step careful, boots scraping against stone. The knocking moved ahead of me, always just out of reach. My radio crackled, then went dead. No static. Just silence. The temperature dropped again, and my breath started to come out in ragged bursts. I told myself I was overreacting. Fear feeds on isolation. I was trained for this. But then the knocking stopped, and I heard breathing that wasn't mine. Heavy, slow. From somewhere above, as if something was standing on the ceiling. I backed out. I didn't run. Running underground gets you killed. I backed out, every nerve lit up, and didn't stop until daylight hit my eyes like a slap. Outside, the forest had changed. The light felt dimmer, filtered through a haze that hadn't been there before. The storm still held at the boundary, thunder rumbling like a warning I hadn't heeded. We never found the hiker. The report said probable accident, unrecovered remains. I signed my name at the bottom and felt like a liar. After that, things escalated. A series of calls came in over the next weeks. Campers reporting footprints around their tents that didn't match any known animal. Too big, too deep. Rangers from other districts laughed it off until one of them saw the tracks himself and went quiet over the radio. The prints showed a weight distribution that made no sense. Toes splayed wide, heel impressions like something that walked upright but didn't quite understand how. Sound became my enemy. At night, I'd hear something pacing just beyond the tree line near my cabin. Not steps, pressure, the soft crush of needles under something heavy. Sometimes it would stop and inhale, a deep pull of air that carried that same mineral cold I'd smelled in the cave. Once I heard my own name whispered from the dark using a voice that had learned the shape of human speech without understanding it. I told myself stress does this. Isolation, responsibility. I doubled down on routine, on checklists and maps. Reason is a shield if you keep it polished, but the forest kept finding ways around it. The storm returned one night without warning. I watched from the lookout tower as clouds slammed into the park boundary and broke apart, rain sheeting down outside while the trees beneath me stayed bone dry. Lightning struck again and again just beyond the line, illuminating the mountains in stark white flashes. Each time the light faded, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the storm, Tall, broad, motionless. A call came through from a nearby ranger station. A group of teenagers had gone missing near the caves. Against protocol, I went alone. I didn't trust anyone else to hear what I'd learned to hear. The cave mouth yawned open, exhaling cold. Inside, the knocking started again, closer this time, reverberating through my bones. Deeper in, the cave widened into a chamber I hadn't seen on any map. The walls were scored with marks, long vertical gouges like something had been dragged, or something had dragged itself. The air stank of wet stone and something musky alive. I felt watched from every angle. Then it stepped into my light. It was taller than any man, shoulders brushing the rock, its shape wrong in ways my brain struggled to catalog, covered in dark, matted hair that glistened with moisture. Its face was a suggestion more than a structure, eyes set too deep, reflecting my headlamp with a dull animal shine. When it breathed, the sound filled the chamber, and the temperature dropped so fast my fingers went numb. It didn't attack. It watched. Its gaze wasn't hunger. It was assessment, like the forest itself was deciding what to do with me. I realized then that the storm wasn't a coincidence. The boundary wasn't protection. It was containment. I backed away, hands shaking, and felt something brush my shoulder. I turned and saw the teenagers huddled against the wall, eyes wide, silent tears carving tracks through the dust on their faces. The thing shifted, blocking the deeper passage, guarding it. I guided them out without turning my back again. Outside, the storm roared, lightning flashing in furious bursts that never crossed the line. The thing stood at the cave mouth, watching us go, its outline framed by darkness. I filed my report carefully. Lost hikers found. Exposure and disorientation. No mention of storms that obey borders. No mention of creatures that learn our voices. I still work the forest, but not as I was. Confidence is gone. In its place is respect, vigilance. I listen now, not just for danger, but for patterns. The forest presses close some nights, whispering through branches, reminding me that reason is fragile and boundaries are agreements that can be revoked. When storms stop at the park border, I know something inside is listening, waiting, and I walk softly because I've learned what happens when the woods decide you've gone far enough. I thought finding them would end it. That's how stories usually work. You face the thing, you survive it, you carry the scars quietly and move on. But forests don't tell stories that way. They circle, they wait, they remember. After that night, the teenagers were evacuated, questioned, wrapped in blankets and disbelief. They couldn't describe what they'd seen. Not really. Their words kept sliding off the shape of it, like rain off bark. Tall, dark, cold. One of them said it felt like being watched by the ground itself. Another said it smelled like snow that had never seen the sun. The official reports smoothed those edges down to panic and hypothermia. I let them. I didn't have language sharp enough to cut the truth free. The storm stayed at the border for 3 days, a wall of violence pacing the park's edge, hammering everything beyond it. Roads washed out, towns flooded. Inside, the forest remained untouched, as if preserved under glass. Satellite images later would show a clean outline, a dark green island surrounded by chaos. People called it a meteorological anomaly. I called it proof. Sleep became an enemy. When I closed my eyes, I felt the cave again, the way the air pressed against my skin, heavy with secrets. Sounds followed me into waking hours, the scrape of something large moving just out of sight. The low thud of footsteps that didn't quite match the rhythm of anything human. Once, while doing maintenance on a remote trail sign, I heard a knock echo through the trees. 3 slow taps, spaced evenly. Wood on wood. I froze, listening. It came again, closer. I left the sign unfinished and didn't look back. Smell started it next, a cold, iron-tinged scent that drifted through the forest without warning. It clung to my clothes, to my hair, followed me back to the cabin. I'd wake to it pooling in the corners of the room, thick enough to taste. No animal I knew carried that smell. It was the scent of stone left too long in the dark, of water that hadn't moved in centuries. Each time it appeared, the forest grew quieter, like everything else knew to stay still. I began to notice patterns. Missing time. Trails that didn't line up with maps I'd memorized years ago. Trees marked with fresh gouges far higher than any bear could reach. The marks pointed inward toward the caves like arrows. The storm returned whenever I got too close to those signs, thunder rolling along the boundary, a reminder of limits. My denial shifted shape. It wasn't about whether something was out there anymore. It was about whether I could live with knowing it and still do my job. I told myself the forest needed witnesses as much as protectors, that my fear was a tool, not a weakness. Tools can break. The breaking point came with the call about the old fire lookout. Decommissioned years ago, deep in the backcountry, accessible only by a narrow trail that snaked along a ridge. A maintenance crew had gone up to assess it for demolition. They didn't come back. Radio's dead. No check-in. Protocol demanded a team, but the storm was already building beyond the border, and I knew in my bones that waiting would cost lives. The hike up felt like walking through a held breath. The air thinned, temperature dropping with every switchback. The forest pressed close, branches knitting together overhead. Halfway up, I found the first sign. A hard hat, crushed flat, set neatly in the middle of the trail. No blood, just that cold mineral smell curling up from it. Sound played tricks on me as I climbed. Wind that wasn't there, footsteps pacing mine, always a half beat behind. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they followed. I reached the lookout at dusk. The tower loomed against the sky, skeletal, windows dark. The storm raged beyond the park, lightning strobing the horizon, but up there the air was dead calm. Inside I found one of the crew. Alive. Barely. He was wedged into a corner, eyes unfocused, hands bleeding where he'd clawed at the walls. He didn't respond to my voice. When I touched his shoulder, he screamed and tried to crawl into the floor. It took everything I had to get him moving. That's when the knocking started again. From beneath the lookout. Wood shuddered with each impact, the whole structure trembling. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. The rhythm drilled into my skull. The man sobbed, burying his face against my chest, whispering about something tall that stood beneath the tower, watching them work, learning their shapes. The floorboards bowed inward. A long, dark shape slid into the gap, fingers curling up through the cracks, too many joints, nails like stone. The temperature plummeted. Frost bloomed across the windows in delicate, deadly patterns. I didn't think. I acted. I got the man out the back, down the stairs, half carrying him as the tower groaned behind us. The storm howled at the boundary, thunder crashing like applause for something ancient. I felt eyes on my back the entire descent, felt breath ghost across my neck, cold enough to burn. We crossed the park line just as the first rain hit us, soaking through in seconds. Behind us, the storm surged forward, finally allowed in, swallowing the lookout in wind and rain. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to see what retreated with it. The man survived. He never returned to the woods. His statement was sealed, filed away where stories go to be buried. I was offered a transfer, safer posting, office work. I declined. Because here's what I've learned and what I live with now. The forest isn't cruel. It isn't kind. It's old. Older than our maps, our names, our need to understand. Some things were never meant to leave the dark places they were born in. Some boundaries exist not to keep us out, but to keep something else contained. I walk differently now, slower. I listen for what doesn't belong as much as what does. When storms stop at the park border, I don't marvel. I prepare. I warn those who will listen. And when I pass the caves, I feel the ground hum beneath my boots, patient and watchful. The forest remembers me. I know that. It knows my shape, my scent, the sound of my breath. I am no longer just a ranger. I am a line it tests, a witness it tolerates. And every day I stay, I carry the quiet understanding that confidence made me blind, fear made me cautious, and respect is the only thing that keeps me alive. If you ever find yourself at the edge of a place where the storm won't cross, don't assume you're safe. Assume you're being given a choice. Turn back or step forward knowing the woods are listening, and some lessons, once learned, never let you go. The choice never really leaves you, even after you think you've made it. It follows you like a shadow that only appears when the light is just right. Weeks passed after the Lookout incident, but time stopped behaving normally for me. Days stretched thin, nights collapsed in on themselves. I'd wake to the sound of my cabin settling and feel my heart race before my mind caught up. I started leaving the lights off, trusting darkness was more than whatever they might reveal. Light shows you shapes, darkness lets you feel intent. I stopped carrying music on patrol. Silence told me more. In silence, I could hear when the forest wasn't breathing the way it should. Birds would cut off mid-call. Insects would vanish from the soundscape like someone had thrown a switch. When that happened, I slowed my pace and checked my exits. Fear stopped being a spike and became a low, constant pressure, like altitude sickness of the soul. The caves became the center of everything, not just geographically, but emotionally. Every trail seemed to curve toward them, every incident traced back there if you followed it far enough. I found old records in the ranger station archives, brittle pages that smelled like dust and mouse droppings. Reports from decades ago, written in careful language by men who didn't have permission to believe what they'd seen. Mentions of storms that stalled, of sounds echoing uphill, of disappearances with no sign of struggle. The word Yeti never appeared, neither did monster. They used words like anomaly, unknown, unverified. One journal wasn't official, a personal notebook tucked into a box of decommissioned gear. The handwriting was tight, urgent. The ranger who wrote it talked about a cave system beneath the caves, a place where sound bent and time slipped. He believed something lived there that predated the forest as we knew it, something that had learned to use storms as fences. He'd drawn a crude map, marking a chamber deep underground with a single word repeated over and over: border. I closed the notebook and felt the weight of decisions settle in my chest. Knowing changes responsibility. Ignorance is light. Knowledge is an anchor. The final escalation didn't come with a missing person. It came with a call from the Weather Service. They wanted to install new monitoring equipment along the park boundary. The anomaly had attracted attention. Scientists, cameras, people who believed observation equaled control. I argued against it. I used words like unstable terrain and protected habitat. They heard liability, not warning. The storm gathered the day they arrived. I watched the clouds stack up like a wall being built brick by brick. The crew joked as they unloaded gear, oblivious to the way the forest leaned away from them. The air tasted metallic, that cold mineral scent threaded through the trees, stronger than ever. As they approached the boundary, the storm locked into place. Rain slammed down inches from their boots, thunder cracking so close it rattled teeth. Cameras rolled. Data streamed. Excitement buzzed. No one noticed the footprints forming behind them, pressing into the soil one by one, deep enough to fill with shadow. I saw it before they did. The way the ground seemed to rise like a hill standing up. The way sound dropped out entirely, leaving only the thud of my own heartbeat. It stepped into view with the inevitability of gravity. Taller than the pines around it, shoulders rolling as if unused to being seen. Hair matted with mud and ice, eyes reflecting not light, but depth. The storm surged, thunder screaming at the boundary, but still it did not cross. Panic finally took them. Shouts, scrambling. One man ran toward the rain and vanished into it, screaming as the storm swallowed him whole. The rest froze, trapped between what they could see and what they couldn't escape. The thing tilted its head, studying them, learning their fear. I moved without thinking, stepping between them and it, not because I believed I could stop it, but because something inside me understood my role. Witness. Warning. Line. I spoke, though my voice shook. I told them to back away slowly, to keep their eyes down, to follow my steps exactly. The thing watched me with a focus that burned. It leaned forward, inhaled, and for a moment I thought it would reach out, that those long, jointed fingers would close around me and pull me into the dark beneath everything. Instead, it stepped back. The ground hummed, a low vibration that traveled up through my bones. The storm roared approval or anger, I couldn't tell. The boundary held. We retreated inch by inch until the forest sound returned in a rush. Birds burst from cover, wind tore through branches. The thing melted back into shadow, leaving behind only those impossible footprints and the cold. The project was canceled. The reports were buried under layers of jargon and probability. The anomaly was reclassified as a data error. The man who ran into the storm was listed as swept away by sudden weather. No body recovered. I stayed. Not because I was brave, but because someone had to remember. Someone had to walk the line and know why it existed. The forest doesn't need us, but it tolerates us when we listen. Now, when storms stop at the park border, I stand still and feel the weight of the land beneath my feet. I think of caves as more than holes in the ground. They are mouths, memories, places where the past breathes. I've learned that reason is a thin shelter, useful but fragile. Awe is heavier. Fear is instructive. Respect is survival. If you ever walk into woods that feel like they're watching you back, don't rush to name what you fear. Names make us careless. Listen instead. Feel the pressure in the air, the way sound bends, the way storms behave like they've been told no. Because some borders are not meant to be crossed. And some storms are not meant to pass. I used to believe borders were lines on maps, ink and policy, something you could step over if you had the right clearance and enough confidence. That belief died quietly without ceremony sometime after the cameras were packed up and the forest swallowed the last trace of human insistence. What replaced it wasn't superstition. It was restraint. The months that followed were quieter on the surface. No missing hikers, no frantic radio calls, no headlines. The kind of calm that invites people to forget. But underneath, the forest shifted its weight. I felt it in the way the ground resisted my boots, in the way certain trails seemed to shorten or lengthen depending on my intent. Distance became emotional rather than measurable. If I approached the caves with purpose, the walk stretched. If I passed them without curiosity, the forest let me go quickly. I stopped pretending that was coincidence. The cold became more selective. It no longer followed the weather. It followed thought. When my mind drifted toward questions I had no right to ask, the temperature dropped sharply, breath fogging even in summer. When I focused on duty, on trail maintenance and visitor safety, the air warmed again. It was as if the land itself responded to attention, rewarding humility and punishing fixation. One night, deep winter, the storm returned stronger than I'd ever seen it. Snow instead of rain, piling up in blinding sheets beyond the park border. Winds howled hard enough to flatten fences and peel roofs from nearby towns. Emergency channels lit up with chaos. Inside the forest, snow fell gently, straight down, each flake perfect and silent. I stood at the boundary, headlamp cutting a pale cone through the dark. The storm raged inches from my face. Snow plastered the invisible wall and slid down, never touching my boots. The silence behind me felt immense, like standing at the mouth of something vast. That's when I heard it again. Not the knock, not footsteps. Breathing. Close. Behind me. I didn't turn around. Every instinct screamed to look, to confirm, to catalog. But I'd learned. Seeing was not always surviving. Some truths are negotiated, not confronted. I stood still, hands relaxed at my sides, breath slow and steady. The breathing matched me. In, out, out. Cold enough that each exhale prickled the skin on my neck. I spoke quietly, not naming it, not challenging it. I said I understood, that I knew why the line existed, that I would keep people back, that I would not dig where the earth had sealed itself. The breathing deepened, then eased. The pressure lifted. When I finally turned, there was nothing there but trees bowed under snow and the long, patient dark between them. The storm stayed all night. By morning, it was gone, leaving destruction everywhere except the forest. News crews called it unprecedented. Meteorologists argued. I drank my coffee cold and said nothing. I've grown older here. My hair has gone gray at the temples. New rangers cycle through, full of certainty and fresh boots. I teach them the rules, the written ones, the unspoken ones. Watch the weather, respect the caves, listen when the forest goes quiet. Don't chase every mystery. Some are doing important work exactly where they are. I never tell them everything. Not because I don't trust them, but because knowledge has weight, and not everyone is meant to carry it. I let the forest decide who learns more. Sometimes on long patrols, I still catch movement at the edge of my vision, a shape between trees, a height that doesn't belong. I don't fear it the way I once did. Fear was sharp and selfish. This is something else. Acknowledgement. Mutual distance. The cave remains sealed on all official maps. Collapsed. Unsafe. Closed to the public. The storms still stop at the park border, obedient to rules written long before we arrived. And I remain here, not as a hero, not as a conqueror, but as a reminder. The wilderness does not exist for our understanding. It exists despite it. If you take anything from this, let it be that awe is not weakness, that fear, when listened to, is a form of intelligence, and that some places endure because someone chooses every day not to push past the final warning. The storm will stop where it's told to stop. So should you. I thought that ending would feel like closure. It didn't. Endings are a luxury forests don't offer. What they offer instead is continuity. Years pass differently when you live beside something that measures time in erosion and root growth. My body slowed before my mind did. Knees stiff in the cold, hands aching after long days. The forest noticed before I did. Trails I once cleared alone now took longer. The land adjusted its demands, subtle but firm, like an employer who knows exactly how much you have left to give. One autumn evening, the caves called to me without sound. No knock, no breath, just a pull, a pressure behind my eyes that said this was not curiosity, but accounting. I didn't fight it. I packed light, radio, headlamp, notebook I'd never used. The storm gathered, respectful, waiting at its line. Inside the cave, the air was steady, almost warm. The mineral scent was softer now, less warning, more presence. The chamber I reached felt familiar, like a place I'd dreamed before I knew its shape. The walls hummed faintly. A vibration felt more than heard. The ground beneath my boots was solid, unyielding. It stood in the far shadow, vast and still, not blocking my path, not retreating, waiting. I understood then that this was never about conquest or fear. It was about balance. The storms were not weapons. They were borders. The caves were not lairs. They were vaults. What lived here was not a monster wearing the forest like a costume. It was a function of it. A keeper of pressure, of thresholds humans were never meant to manage. I didn't speak. Words would have cheapened it. I placed the notebook on the stone floor and stepped back. An offering of witness, not explanation. The thing inclined its head just enough to register. The vibration eased. The cave exhaled. When I emerged, the storm lifted. Not violently, gently, like a hand relaxing. I retired the following spring. Officially, on paper. I trained my replacement carefully, choosing what to say and what to leave unsaid. The forest watched him with interest, the way it once watched me. That was enough. I still live nearby, close enough to feel the weather change before it's announced, close enough to know when the forest goes quiet for reasons that have nothing to do with predators or wind. When storms stop at the park border, I don't go out anymore. I sit. I listen. I trust the line to hold. The lesson I carry isn't about fear of the unknown. It's about restraint in the face of it, about knowing when protection means standing back, not stepping forward, about understanding that some guardians are not meant to be seen and some witnesses are not meant to be remembered. The forest continues. The storms obey. The caves keep their secrets. And I remain what I was shaped into, not the one who crossed the border, the one who learned why it exists. I didn't think the forest would call me again after that. I believed retirement would loosen whatever thread still tied me to those caves, to the storms, to the thing that stood watch beneath stone. I was wrong about that too. The forest doesn't sever connections. It thins them, stretches them, tests whether they still hold. The call came in the middle of winter, years after I turned in my badge. Not a phone call, not a knock. It came as a pressure change inside my chest, like the first warning of altitude sickness. I was sitting at my kitchen table watching snow drift past the window when the silence outside thickened. No wind, no distant highway noise, just that heavy pause I'd learned to recognize. The storm was coming, and it was stopping exactly where it always did. I drove as far as the plowed road allowed and walked the rest. My knees protested, my breath burned. The forest opened for me anyway, branches bending just enough, paths feeling shorter than they had any right to be. Respect still counted for something. At the boundary, the storm raged in full force. Snow blasted sideways, thunder cracking even in the cold, a violence that felt almost frustrated. Inside the park, the air was calm, cold but gentle, flakes settling softly on my shoulders. I stood there a long time, feeling the familiar hum beneath my boots, the line vibrating with tension held in check. I realized then what the call had been about. Not danger, not escalation, succession. The forest didn't need me to fight or flee. It needed me to remember, to carry forward the understanding that had been paid for in fear and silence. Somewhere beyond the trees, people were watching radar screens and arguing models. Inside the line, something ancient stood its ground, patient as bedrock. I closed my eyes and listened. Not for breathing, not for knocking. Just for the forest itself, the low composite sound of countless lives continuing because restraint had been honored. The pressure eased. The storm roared itself hoarse and finally began to move on, sliding along the border like water finding the edge of a vessel. When it was over, I turned back. No ceremony, no final look. Some goodbyes don't need witnesses. Now, when I tell this story, I'm careful. I don't dress it up. I don't name what shouldn't be named. I talk about storms that stop, about caves that stay closed, about listening when the land tells you enough is enough. People lean in when I speak. They feel it, even if they don't understand why. That's the legacy, not proof, not evidence, awareness. The forest remains what it has always been, vast, indifferent, capable of awe and terror in equal measure. The caves keep their cold breath and their quiet vigilance. The storms still obey a line that no instrument can see. And I live with the knowledge that reason bends, that fear can educate, and that respect is the strongest boundary we have. I was never meant to conquer the darkness in those woods. I was meant to stand at the edge of it and know when not to step forward. The first time the forest made me feel small, it wasn't because of the height of the trees or the depth of the shadows. It was because the silence leaned toward me as if it knew my name and was waiting for me to say it out loud. I've spent most of my adult life wearing a badge that people assume means safety, authority, control. I was in my mid-30s when this story really began, though I'd already been a ranger for over a decade by then. I worked a remote stretch of federally protected forest, the kind tourists take pictures of from a distance and locals avoid talking about after dark. Old-growth timber, glacial valleys, caves the maps only half acknowledged, places where radios didn't always work and compasses liked to lie. The locals, loggers, seasonal hunters, the families who'd lived on the forest's edge for generations, used to watch me with a certain look, not disrespect, more like pity mixed with relief. Like they were glad someone else was walking into the trees so they didn't have to. They'd warn me in half jokes and unfinished sentences. Don't stay out too late. If you hear something calling, don't answer. Some trails move when you're not looking. I laughed it off for years. That's what training does to you. It builds a shell of reason. Every sound has a source. Every missing hiker a pattern. Every shadow a trick of light. Fear, I believed, came from ignorance, and I was well informed. That belief lasted until the night the trees grew too close together for me to turn back. It started with a routine patrol, late autumn, the kind of cold that smells metallic like snow thinking about falling. I was checking a series of backcountry campsites near a limestone cave system, unofficially named, poorly explored. The caves were a mouth in the earth locals pretended not to notice. I'd been warned not to linger there alone. I lingered anyway. That night, sound was the first thing that felt wrong. Not the absence of it, but its arrangement. The forest has layers of noise if you listen long enough. Wind through needles, distant water, small animals arguing with each other in the underbrush. But as I walked, those layers began to flatten like someone turning knobs down one by one. until all I could hear was my own breathing and a faint, rhythmic knock. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats again. At first, I told myself it was wood contracting in the cold, or a bird, or my boots echoing strangely between trunks. Rational explanations stacked neatly in my head. I even smiled at myself for being jumpy. Then the knock answered my footsteps. I stopped walking. It stopped too. I waited, counted heartbeats. When I stepped forward again, it came back, closer this time. Not louder, closer, as if distance itself was folding. That was the first moment doubt crept in. Not fear. Doubt. The uncomfortable realization that the forest was responding to me. I radioed in a status check. Static answered. I tried again. Nothing. The trees seemed tighter now, branches knitting together overhead, the trail narrowing until it felt less like a path and more like a suggestion. I should have turned back. I knew that. But another part of me, the part that had worn this badge too long, refused to let superstition dictate my movement. That was my first mistake. The knock changed into something else as night settled in, a low, breathy sound, almost vocal, almost human. It followed me all the way back to my truck, never once breaking rhythm. When I finally slammed the door shut, the sound stopped instantly. I sat there for a long time, hands on the wheel, convincing myself I'd imagined it. I didn't file a report. I wish I had. The second incident came weeks later, and this time it was scent that warned me something was wrong. There'd been a disappearance. Solo hiker. Experienced. No distress call, just a car left at a trailhead that hadn't been logged for decades. The search party split up, and I took the northern ridge, dense forest, steep drop-offs, and that same cave system yawning somewhere beneath the roots. The smell hit me just after noon. Not decay, not animal musk, something colder, sharper, like wet stone mixed with old iron. It coated the air, clung to the back of my throat. Every instinct I had screamed wrong, but again I rationalized. Minerals, moisture, rotting leaves. As I moved deeper, the temperature dropped unnaturally fast. My breath fogged, fingers stiffening despite the exertion. The forest floor grew soft underfoot, almost spongy, as if I were walking over something hollow. That's when I found the tracks. They weren't bare, too narrow at the heel, too long at the toe. Whatever made them walked upright, but unevenly, like it wasn't used to the shape of its own body. Each step pressed deep into the soil, far deeper than something human-sized should have managed. I followed them, because that's what I did back then. I followed problems. The tracks led to the cave. Standing at the mouth of it, the smell intensified. The darkness inside wasn't empty, it felt occupied, like a held breath. I called out, identifying myself, my voice swallowed after only a few feet. No echo, no answer. Then I heard it. Not a roar, not a growl. A voice. Low, strained, trying to form words it didn't understand. It repeated a sound over and over, something between my name and the word help. My skin prickled as recognition set in. It wasn't calling to me. It was calling me. Every memory I had of ranger training told me to wait for backup. But layered beneath that was a deeper fear, not of being hurt, but of being replaced. As if something in that cave had learned enough about me to step into my life if I let it. I backed away slowly. The voice followed, matching my retreat with careful precision. When I turned and ran, the forest seemed to close ranks, branches tearing at my jacket, roots grabbing at my boots. The smell chased me all the way to open ground. The search team never found the missing hiker. Officially, the case went cold. Unofficially, the locals stopped meeting my eyes. By the third time, fear had settled into me like a bruise, tender, unavoidable. But it was still manageable, still something I could compartmentalize, until it became personal. A winter storm trapped me overnight at a backcountry station, just a small structure with one door, one window, and a radio that worked when it felt like it. Snow fell heavy and wet, muting the forest into a suffocating quiet, the kind that makes you feel like sound itself is illegal. That's when the knocking started, not on the door, on the walls. Slow, deliberate, moving, circling the cabin, fingers or something like fingers testing the structure. I sat frozen, gun in hand, breath shallow. Every knock landed directly behind my eyes. I told myself it was branches. Wind. Ice shifting. Then it knocked back. I whispered without thinking. Just one word. A question. The knock paused. Then came again, this time in the same rhythm as my heartbeat. Panic stripped away reason faster than anything I'd ever known. I realized then that whatever was out there didn't need to break in. It just needed me to acknowledge it, to invite it closer. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, the snow around the cabin was untouched, except for a single line of prints leading away toward the caves. Too deep, too deliberate. I filed my report. It was quietly buried. The final descent happened months later when confidence had finally rotted into obsession. I needed answers, needed proof I wasn't losing my mind. I told myself I was hunting closure. The cave was colder than I remembered. The walls damp, breathing, my light barely cut through the dark, shadows twisting into shapes I refused to name. The smell was overwhelming now, stone, iron, something ancient and animal. Deep inside, I found markings, scratches high up on the walls, symbols carved with patience, not violence, and bones, arranged, curated. That's when the sound stopped being distant. It stood at the edge of my light, tall, wrong, its outline shifting like it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. Its eyes reflected back at me, too aware, too familiar. I understood then that it wasn't guarding the forest, it was remembering it. I ran. I don't remember how I got out. Only that the trees outside felt tighter than ever, pressing in until the sky was a rumor. I didn't stop running until I hit the road. I resigned weeks later. Now, years on, I still dream of the knock, of the voice trying to learn my shape. The forest still stands, people still disappear, and sometimes when the wind moves just right, I swear I hear my name spoken with a mouth that never learned how. The trees are closer now, and I know better than to turn back. I thought leaving the uniform behind would put distance between me and what lived out there. I believed that once I stopped carrying the radio, once my boots no longer followed marked trails, the forest would forget me. That was another lie reason told me to survive. The truth was quieter. The truth was that the forest had already learned my shape. I moved 3 states away, took work that kept me indoors. Paperwork, training manuals. Stories passed down by people who never had to test them. At night, I told myself the dreams were just echoes, memory losing its edges. But memory doesn't knock. Memory doesn't wait outside your walls. The first sign that it hadn't let me go came in a grocery store parking lot of all places. Snow melting into slush, fluorescent lights humming overhead. I was loading bags into my trunk when I smelled it again. Cold stone. Old iron. For a moment, the world tilted. The asphalt beneath my boots felt too soft, too yielding. I stood perfectly still, afraid that if I moved, I'd hear it, that low, patient sound arranging itself behind me. I didn't turn around. When the smell faded, I laughed too loudly, drawing stares. I told myself fear doesn't travel. Fear needs context. Trees, darkness, caves. That night, I dreamed of roots growing through walls. I lasted another year before I went back. I didn't plan to. I told myself I was just driving through, that I needed to see it in daylight, stripped of mystery. Closure. That word again. The most dangerous one I know. The forest greeted me without ceremony. Same road. Same subtle bend where the trees began to lean inward like listeners. New signage, fresh paint. But beneath it all, the same pressure. The same sense that space itself was being negotiated. I parked farther out than before, walked in without a radio, without a badge, just a flashlight and the weight of everything I hadn't said. Sound became the adversary this time, not what I heard, but what refused to appear. My footsteps were wrong, too loud, too isolated, no birds, no wind. Even my breathing felt discouraged, like the forest preferred I conserve it. As I walked, the trees grew closer together. Not suddenly, gradually, plausibly. Trunks shifting just enough that the path narrowed without announcing itself, branches overlapping, blotting out the sky in careful increments. I slowed, measuring distance, aware of how easily direction could dissolve here. That's when I heard footsteps that weren't mine. They didn't follow my rhythm, didn't imitate it either. They stayed just out of sync, close enough to acknowledge, far enough to deny. Each step pressed deeper into the earth than it should have, like the ground wanted to remember the weight. I told myself not to run. I told myself panic was the invitation. The smell returned stronger now, thick enough to taste. The air grew colder with every breath, not biting, just insistent, like something lowering the temperature to preserve what it kept. I reached the clearing near the cave entrance just as the light began to fail. Dusk stretched shadows until they touched. The mouth of the cave waited exactly where it always had, unchanged, patient, familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. I hadn't noticed the carvings before. Not clearly. They circled the stone like a story told over itself too many times. Crude shapes, long limbs, bent spines, figures pressed close together until they overlapped, and among them, smaller shapes, human ones, reaching upward. The footsteps stopped. I felt it then, not behind me, not in front, but beneath, a vibration traveling up through the soles of my boots, through bone and memory. The cave exhaled. I understood finally that it wasn't hunting. It was keeping count. I backed away, heart pounding so hard it blurred my vision. That's when the voice came, not from the cave, but from the trees. My voice. Not perfectly. Close enough to pass in the dark. It spoke my name once, just once. Testing. Every instinct I'd ever buried clawed its way up. This wasn't about belief anymore. This was about boundaries. About what happens when you stay long enough in a place that doesn't recognize the difference between observation and participation. I ran. The forest resisted immediately. Branches whipped across my face. Roots rose like traps. The air thickened, heavy with that metallic cold. The footsteps returned, no longer pacing me, but angling, cutting me off with frightening intelligence. Then the knock came again. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. It echoed everywhere at once. Tree trunks, ground, inside my chest. I tripped, fell hard, breath knocked from my lungs. For a moment, I lay there staring up at the black lattice of branches overhead, convinced this was where it would end. Instead, the sound stopped. Silence slammed down so hard it hurt. I crawled backwards, scrambling until my hands found gravel. Road. The forest ended abruptly, like it had reached a line it refused to cross. I didn't stop until I was in the car. Doors locked, engine screaming awake. In the rearview mirror, the trees stood perfectly still. Too still. I never went back after that. Now I live somewhere flat, open. No caves, no forests thick enough to close ranks. People ask why I flinch at certain sounds, why I don't hike anymore, why I lock my doors before sunset. I don't tell them this, that some nights, when everything is quiet and the world feels just a little too arranged, I hear the knock, not on wood, not on walls, but inside my own breathing. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. And I know that whatever lives where the trees grow too close together never stopped listening. The doctors I spoke to later, because of course I spoke to doctors, called it residual stress. Post-exposure anxiety. They gave it clean names, names that fitly on clipboards. They said the mind sometimes keeps a door open even after the body leaves. They said grounding techniques help, controlled breathing, lists of objects in the room, proof that you are here. What they didn't understand is that here was no longer a fixed place for me, because once you realize a landscape can recognize you, distance stops meaning what it used to. I began noticing patterns, small ones at first. A trail map pinned crookedly on a corkboard in a visitor center I'd never worked at, tilted at the same angle as the cave entrance. A child humming a rhythm in a diner that matched the knock exactly. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. When I looked up, the child had stopped, staring at me with an expression too old for his face, like he was waiting to see if I'd respond. I never did. Sound had become my enemy by then. Silence too clean made my skin crawl. Random noise, traffic, voices, television left on overnight felt safer. I slept with the radio playing low, even when the static threaded itself into shapes that almost sounded like speech. Almost. Touch came next. It started with temperature. Rooms growing inexplicably cold around me, even in summer. Not drafts, localized pockets, like the air itself was remembering something colder. I'd wake in the night with one arm numb, convinced it had been pressed against stone for hours. Sometimes I found faint marks on my skin in the morning, lines, shallow impressions that faded by noon. I stopped looking at them too closely. Denial is a survival skill when fear gets creative. I tried to build a new identity. Took a job training new rangers, classroom only. I told stories carefully edited of danger that made sense. Weather, terrain, human error. I avoided caves in my lectures, avoided disappearances that didn't resolve, avoided the word unknown. But the trainees brought it back anyway. They always do. One evening, after class, a young ranger lingered. Nervous energy. The kind I recognized immediately because it used to live in my chest. He asked if I'd ever worked near a cave system up north, asked if I'd heard stories about something tall moving through the timberline after storms. I told him stories grow in places where facts fail. He nodded, unconvinced, and said, "It sounded like it was trying to breathe right." That night, the knocking returned louder than it had in years. Not outside, inside the walls. It moved from room to room with a patience that felt rehearsed. I sat on the bed, hands clamped over my ears, realizing too late that it wasn't testing the house. It was mapping me. I didn't run this time. There was nowhere left to go. Instead, I spoke, not aloud, but in that private place behind the eyes where intention lives. I told it I was done, that I wouldn't go back, that I wouldn't answer, that I refused to be a shape it could borrow. The knocking stopped. For 3 days, everything was quiet. Then came the dream that finally broke me. I was back in the forest, but older, trees thicker, sky narrower. The trail behind me had sealed shut, bark knitting itself closed where my footprints should have been. Ahead, the cave waited, but its mouth was wider now, stretched into something like a grin. Inside, I saw the bones again, but this time they were arranged into familiar outlines. Camp chairs, backpacks, a ranger's hat, carefully placed. And at the far wall, carved deep and careful, was my silhouette, not as I was, but as the forest remembered me. Bent. Listening. Almost fitting. When I woke, my throat hurt like I'd been screaming for hours. That was when I understood the truth I'd been avoiding since the beginning. The forest doesn't take everyone. It takes those who stay long enough to believe they understand it. I resigned fully after that. No more training, no more uniforms. I moved again, further this time. Desert country, open land where the horizon keeps its promises. I learned the sound of wind without trees. Learned how heat replaces cold as a pressure instead of an absence. It helped, mostly. But sometimes, late at night, when the desert goes still in its own way, I catch myself listening too hard, counting breaths, measuring silence. And I remember how the locals used to look at me, relieved, like I was walking into something so they didn't have to. Now I know why. Because the woods don't just hide things, they keep them. And if you listen long enough, if you walk far enough past the point where trails feel optional, the forest will begin to close its distance to you. Not in anger, not in hunger, but in recognition. The trees grow closer together for a reason. They don't want you to turn back. They want you to stay long enough to be remembered. I tell myself that remembering is not the same as belonging. That thought is the only thing that lets me sleep now. Years have passed since I last stood beneath those trees. My hair has gone gray at the edges. My hands ache in cold weather even here, where cold has no right to exist. People around me know me as quiet, observant. The kind of man who pauses before answering simple questions like he's listening to something just beyond the room. They're not wrong, because the forest never stopped teaching me. It just changed the lesson. I used to believe fear was something you outran or overpowered, that courage meant pushing forward when your instincts begged you to stop. That's what the badge drilled into us. Protect, proceed, secure. But the woods showed me a different truth, one I resisted until it nearly swallowed me whole. Some places don't want to be solved. Some places don't want witnesses. They want reverence, distance, silence. And when you deny them that, when you insist on dragging light into every hollow, they respond, not with violence at first, but with intimacy. They learn your voice, your rhythm, your weaknesses. They press closer, slowly enough that you convince yourself it's your imagination tightening the space. That's how the trees win. Even now, I receive emails from former colleagues, disappearances, unmarked trails appearing where none existed before, caves breathing warm air in winter. Sounds that repeat too precisely to be animals. They ask what I think, what I'd do. I never answer directly. Instead, I tell them this: pay attention to the moment when the forest stops feeling large and starts feeling deliberate, the moment when sound behaves differently, when the air changes temperature without warning, when your name feels like it doesn't fully belong to you anymore. That's your warning. Because the real danger was never the thing in the cave, not exactly. It was the part of me that refused to listen, the part that believed experience made me immune, the part that thought authority granted permission. The forest corrected that belief, and in doing so, it gave me something I didn't know I needed until much later: humility, sharp enough to survive. I no longer chase explanations. I no longer need proof. I don't need to see what lives in the dark to respect it. I've learned that survival isn't about conquering fear. It's about recognizing when fear is trying to keep you human. Sometimes late at night, when the wind moves just right across open land, I still hear echoes. Not the knock anymore, not the voice, just a memory of pressure, of closeness, of a boundary I nearly crossed and somehow didn't. In those moments, I breathe slowly. I remind myself where I am. I remind myself that leaving was a choice, and that choosing to leave mattered. Because not everyone does. Some rangers never come back. Some hikers are only ever found in pieces that don't make sense. Some names get spoken by mouths that never learned how to be human, deep beneath roots that have been drinking secrets for centuries. The forest keeps them, but it did not keep me. And that is the lesson I carry now, heavier than any pack I ever wore. That strength is knowing when to step back, when to let the trees close ranks without you inside them, when to walk away before curiosity hardens into invitation. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and the path behind you feels narrower than it should, if the silence starts arranging itself around your breathing, if the trees seem to lean not to block your way, but to listen, turn back. Do not test how close they can grow. Because once the forest learns your shape, it never forgets. And not all memories are meant to walk back out into the light. There is one last thing I've never told anyone, not doctors, not colleagues, not the strangers who email me in the middle of the night looking for reassurance I can't give. The forest did let me go, but only after it was certain I understood why. Understanding didn't come all at once. It came slowly, in fragments, the way frost creeps across glass. In the years since I left, I've replayed every moment I ignored my instincts, every time I chose authority over humility, curiosity over caution. I see now how confidently I walked into places that had never asked to be known. We tell ourselves the wilderness exists for us, to be mapped, protected, explained. We build trails and signs and rules as if language alone can tame something older than language. But the truth is quieter and far more dangerous. The forest doesn't need us, and it doesn't care if we understand it. What it cares about is balance. That thing in the cave, whatever name fear tries to give it, wasn't evil in the way stories prefer. It wasn't hunting out of hunger or malice. It was doing what the forest has always done. Removing what stayed too long, what listened too closely, what tried to take without knowing when to stop. I had crossed that line. And the only reason I'm here to tell this story is because, at the last possible moment, I chose to retreat instead of insist. That choice cost me my career, my certainty, my sense of belonging anywhere with trees tall enough to block the sky, but it gave me something rarer, a memory that still breathes, still warns, still holds me back when pride tries to push me forward again. I think about that now when I walk open land at dusk. I think about how easy it would be to miss the warning signs if you don't know what you're looking for. How many people mistake unease for imagination? How many tell themselves one more step won't matter? It always matters. Because the forest doesn't close in all at once. It doesn't rush. It waits until turning back feels embarrassing, until doubt feels weaker than momentum, until the trees have grown just close enough that retreat feels like failure. That's when it decides whether you leave as a memory or become one. I live with that knowledge now. I carry it the way others carry faith. It guides my steps, keeps me from mistaking courage for recklessness. It reminds me that some doors are meant to stay closed, and some paths exist only to teach you when to stop walking. So if you ever find yourself out there, camping, hiking, chasing solitude beneath a canopy that feels older than thought, and the forest begins to feel intimate in the wrong way, if sound starts to behave like language, if the air turns cold without reason, if your instincts whisper something you don't want to hear, listen. Do not prove anything. Do not answer back. Leave while the trees still allow space for you to pass. Because once they grow too close together, once the forest recognizes you as something that belongs inside it, turning back stops being an option, and the woods have all the time in the world to wait for those who don't. The ranger realized the forest was closing in around him. I knew the forest was done with me the moment it stopped making noise. No wind in the needles, no insects, no birds correcting my footsteps. Just the sound of my own breath, loud and wet inside my head, as if something else were listening to it from very close by. I've been a federal ranger for most of my adult life, long enough to know that silence in the wilderness is never peace. It's coordination. It's every living thing deciding at once to pay attention to the same threat. That threat was me. I didn't take this job because I loved nature. That's what people like to hear, but it's not true. I took it because I needed structure after what happened in the Bitterroots 12 years ago. A missing hiker, a boy, technically, 21, college kid, first solo trip. I was part of the search grid. I logged the coordinates. I signed the reports. I was the one who called off the dogs when command said we'd exceeded survivability windows. I told myself I followed protocol. But protocol doesn't explain why I still hear his voice when snow settles too fast. This recording, if anyone ever finds it, is not an incident report. It's not a statement. It's what happens when you realize the land has been keeping track longer than you have. The forest I was assigned to at the time of this incident doesn't matter. If I name it, people will try to make sense of it geographically. They'll look for folklore. They'll search for similar cases. They'll try to box this into something manageable. It wasn't. It was federal land, mountainous, old growth, mixed with burn scars from fires that never quite died. There were areas we weren't encouraged to patrol too deeply. No official signage, just quiet directives passed down from supervisors who never put things in writing. Places where GPS drifted. Places where radios hissed like someone breathing into them with their mouth open. We joked about it. We always do. That's how rangers survive. Gallows humor, bad coffee, and the assumption that whatever's out there follows rules. The first sign something was wrong wasn't visual. It was procedural. 3 disappearances in 5 weeks. No campsites disturbed, no blood, no gear trails, just people stepping off established paths and never stepping back on. 2 locals. 1 seasonal volunteer who knew the area well enough to correct senior staff on trail names. When I reviewed the reports, the locations didn't cluster, they overlapped. Same square mile, different elevations, different times of day. Like something was waiting, not hunting. I was assigned solo reconnaissance. That should have been my first refusal. Solo patrols in active disappearance zones violate common sense, if not policy. But manpower was thin, and I didn't argue the way I used to. I told myself I preferred being alone, that it kept my thoughts quieter. I parked the truck at dawn. Air already wrong, too warm for the season, carrying a smell like wet iron and sap that had burned once and remembered it. My radio crackled before I even clipped it to my vest, then went dead. I logged it as interference and started hiking anyway. Rationality is a habit. You don't lose it all at once. You shed it piece by piece, convincing yourself each loss is temporary. The trail behaved normally for the first mile. Boots in dirt, squirrels, distant woodpecker. I noted a tree with old claw marks too high for bear and told myself it was erosion playing tricks on scale. Then the sound dropped out. It wasn't abrupt, more like someone slowly lowering a volume knob. Wind dulled. Birds cut off mid-call. Even my footsteps felt absorbed, like the ground had turned soft without changing texture. I stopped walking. The silence didn't change. I turned in a slow circle, scanning tree lines, listening for my own movement to echo or return to me. It didn't. I smelled something then, burnt hair, faint but unmistakable. Not smoke, not fire. Protein charred too close to skin. I checked my boots, my pack, my clothes, thinking maybe I'd brushed against something dead. Nothing. That's when I heard my name, not shouted, not whispered, spoken conversationally from somewhere ahead and slightly downhill. My first response was anger. Rangers don't like being snuck up on. I called out, identified myself, demanded the speaker do the same. No answer. I moved forward, hand resting on my sidearm more out of habit than expectation. I'm trained to de-escalate, trained to assume lost hikers, not threats. I found footprints, barefoot, adult-sized, deep enough to suggest weight but wrong in the heel as if the foot had bent in places it shouldn't. They led off the trail into dense undergrowth I knew for a fact had been impassable the week before. Branches were parted, not broken, like something had passed through without resistance. The ground vibrated under my boots then, not like an earthquake, more like the hum you feel standing near heavy machinery. It came in pulses, each one followed by a pressure in my chest that made it harder to breathe, as if the air itself had thickened. I told myself it was anxiety. I told myself that right up until I saw the figure standing between the trees. Human shape, Ranger green, hat brim low. It was me, or close enough that my brain tried to accept it. Same stance, same pack, same posture I'd seen in mirrors 1,000 times without looking. It didn't move when I moved. It didn't breathe. Its reflection in a shallow puddle at its feet lagged behind by half a second. I raised my radio, thumb pressing transmit out of reflex. Static poured out, layered with something else, voices overlapping, speaking names that didn't belong to me. The figure tilted its head. I smelled blood then. Fresh, warm, completely out of place. I don't remember stepping back. I only remember falling and the ground feeling colder than it should have been, frost biting through my pants despite the heat in the air. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. So were the footprints. So was the trail. Trees stood closer together now. I know that sounds impossible, but I have spent my life judging distances in wilderness. Paths don't rearrange themselves. Underbrush doesn't advance. Something had closed a ring. I started walking in what I thought was north. The forest responded by making my own footsteps echo ahead of me, half a second early. I wasn't alone anymore. I just didn't know how many of me were there. I tried to anchor myself with procedure. Map. Compass. Bearings. The compass needle spun twice, slowed, then pointed directly back the way I'd come, even though I hadn't moved. I tapped it, checked it against the backup. Same result. North had decided it lived somewhere else. That was when I realized I couldn't hear my own heartbeat anymore. Not because it had stopped. My pulse throbbed visibly in my wrists, but because something deeper, lower, had taken over the rhythm. A subsonic thump traveling through the soil, up through bone. The forest wasn't silent anymore. It was breathing. I radioed command again. Nothing but layered static, and underneath it a sound like someone slowly dragging their fingers across a metal grate. Then a voice broke through, distorted but unmistakable. Unit 7, say again. My call sign. My supervisor's cadence. Relief hit hard enough to make my knees weak. I confirmed my position as best I could, described the loss of trail, the compass anomaly, the figure. I expected interruption, skepticism, questions. Instead, there was a pause. Then, you're not cleared for that sector. I told him I hadn't crossed any boundary markers, that I'd logged entry points, that the map didn't show. Listen to me, he said, and his voice had gone flat, almost rehearsed. You need to turn around, walk back the way you came. Do not follow anything that looks like you. I asked him what that meant. The radio went dead. I stood there for a long time after that, replaying the words, not cleared for that sector. as if the forest itself were a restricted area layered beneath the official one, as if someone had known this would happen eventually and written rules for it. I did turn around, or I thought I did. The trees ahead opened into a shallow ravine I had no memory of. Rock walls tight on either side, streaked with mineral stains the color of old bruises. The air inside it was cold, unnaturally so, and smelled of wet fur and something sweet underneath, like rot wrapped in flowers. My breath fogged. It was summer. There were markings on the stone. Not petroglyphs, not exactly. Scratches too precise to be animal, too deep to be accidental. Repeating shapes, spirals that tightened inward until the center gouge punched straight through the rock. Some were filled with black residue that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. I didn't touch them. I made that decision very consciously. I remember thinking that whatever rules still applied to me were fragile and contact might break the last one. Halfway through the ravine, I heard footsteps behind me. Not echoes, not animals, measured, familiar. I sped up. They sped up. I stopped. They stopped. When I turned, there were 3 figures standing where the ravine curved, all wearing ranger uniforms, all wrong in different ways. One's head lolled at an angle no neck could support. Another's hands hung too low, fingers brushing the stone with each step. The third, closest, had my face, but older. Eyes sunk deep, skin drawn tight as if something beneath it were trying to get out. "You left us," it said. The voice wasn't coming from its mouth. It came from everywhere else, the stone, the air, the space between thoughts. I told myself it was stress hallucination, textbook, isolation, heat, guilt manifesting under pressure. Then the ground behind me collapsed. I fell into darkness, so complete it felt thick, like falling into water that refused to part. I hit hard, shoulder screaming, breath driven out of me in a wet cough that tasted like rust. When my vision came back, I realized I was underground, not a natural cave. The walls were smooth, reinforced, old concrete sweating moisture. A corridor stretched ahead, lit by emergency bulbs so dim they barely qualified as light. Stenciled numbers marked doorways on either side, most of them scratched out. This wasn't on any map. I recognized the architecture anyway. I'd seen photos and training manuals no one acknowledged using anymore. Cold War-era bunkers, decommissioned sites sealed and forgotten after budgets dried up and priorities shifted. Except this one wasn't sealed. It was waiting. The door nearest me was ajar. Inside, the room was empty, except for a table bolted to the floor and a recorder sitting on top of it. The same model we used for field logs before everything went digital. It was already playing. A voice filled the room, my voice, calm, professional, dated 12 years earlier. I recognized the report immediately. The missing hiker, the one from the Bitter Roots. But the details were wrong. In the recording, I described finding the boy. Alive, disoriented. Leading me somewhere, he said, was where the trees learn your shape. I described following him off-grid, past warning signs I didn't remember existing. Then my recorded voice stopped mid-sentence. Something else took over. A sound like breathing through soil. I staggered back, knocking into another door that swung open at my touch. This room was worse. Rows of shelves stacked with personal effects, boots, packs, notebooks, radios, each tagged with a name and date. Every date matched a disappearance. Some names were crossed out, some were circled. One tag bore my name. My knees buckled. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, and laughed until my throat hurt because the alternative was screaming. I understood then what had been hunting us. Not creatures, continuity. The forest didn't kill. It collected. It copied. It learned cadence and posture and voice, then sent those reflections back out to bring more in. Witnesses who never left witnesses. I heard footsteps again, closer now, echoing through concrete halls that shouldn't have existed beneath root systems centuries old. I ran. The bunker descended deeper than physics allowed. Stairs folded back on themselves. Corridors narrowed until my shoulders scraped the walls. The temperature dropped with every level, frost forming on surfaces that smelled faintly of ozone and decay. At the lowest point, I found a door marked only with a handprint burned into the steel. The vibrations were strongest here. My chest felt crushed under invisible weight. Each breath took effort, like breathing through wet cloth. I didn't want to open the door. I did anyway. Inside was a chamber carved directly into bedrock. No concrete, no reinforcement, just raw stone pulsing faintly, like muscle under skin. Figures stood embedded in the walls. Not statues, people, rangers, hikers, locals, preserved mid-motion, mouths open as if speaking or screaming, eyes tracking something only they could see. Their shadows moved independently, stretching and recoiling like living things. At the center of the chamber was a pit. I didn't look into it. I didn't need to. I knew, somehow, that whatever lay at the bottom wasn't interested in my body. It wanted my pattern, my voice, my authority. Something shifted behind me. I turned slowly, already knowing what I'd see. The older version of myself stood in the doorway, skin pulled thin, eyes bright with a relief that made my stomach turn. "You can stop running now," it said. "We already know how you move." The ground trembled. The walls leaned in. The forest, above, below, everywhere, drew a breath. The thing wearing my face stepped aside without touching the door frame. It didn't need to. The steel bent inward on its own, groaning like something alive trying not to scream. I backed away until my heels hit the edge of the pit. Heat rolled up from it in slow pulses, completely wrong against the frost crusting the walls. It smelled like old blood and wet leaves left too long in plastic. Beneath that was something electrical. Ozone. Copper. Like a storm trapped underground. "You don't understand," I said, because that's what people say when they understand too much too fast. The thing smiled with my mouth. "We do," it said. "That's why we're still here." I glanced at the figures in the walls. Some of them twitched, just barely. Fingers flexing inside stone, eyes moving in sockets filled with mineral growth. They weren't dead. They weren't alive. They were being remembered. I thought of the boy from the Bitterroots, of how the dogs had circled one spot endlessly, whining, refusing to cross an invisible line, of how I'd convinced myself that meant nothing was there. I had been wrong. The pit exhaled. Sound poured out of it. Voices layered so densely they became a physical force. Names, pleas, commands, ranger call signs stretching back decades. Some of them were giving directions. Some were begging someone to stop listening. My radio crackled to life on my chest. "Unit 7, my supervisor said, calm as ever. "You're out of bounds." I laughed again, short and sharp, hysteria snapping through my ribs. "You knew," I said to the radio. "You all knew." A pause. Then, "We know what stays if it isn't guided." The thing beside the door nodded. "They taught us," it said, "how to wear you, how to speak for you." The chamber shuddered. Dust rained down. One of the figures tore free from the wall with a sound like wet cloth ripping. It fell to the floor and didn't get up. Its shadow peeled itself off and slid toward the pit. I realized then that the bunker wasn't a containment site. It was a mouth. Every disappearance, every missing person report quietly closed, every search called off early, it all fed this place. Not bodies, behaviors, patterns of authority and trust. Rangers made the best bait because people followed us without question, including other rangers. The older me took a step forward. I felt it in my bones like a mirror nerve firing. "You can go back," it said. "One of us always does." The implication settled heavy in my gut. I thought of the crossed-out names on the tags, of how some disappearances ended officially while others were never resolved, of how occasionally someone would be found wandering miles away, dehydrated, traumatized, unable to explain where they'd been. Returned. "What happens to the other one?" I asked. It tilted its head. "He keeps the forest quiet." The pit surged upward then, not physically but perceptually. The darkness inside it rose like a tide, pressing against my senses. My vision narrowed. My thoughts blurred at the edges. I felt something brush my ankle, cold, curious, intimate. I fired my sidearm into the pit. The sound was swallowed instantly. No echo, no impact. The thing wearing me didn't flinch. Neither did the figures in the walls. "You can't threaten memory," it said gently. I did the only thing left that felt like choice. I stepped backward. For a moment there was weightlessness. Then pain so intense it erased everything else. I hit something hard, rolled, slid, and kept sliding until I slammed into a wall of packed earth and roots. I lay there gasping, lungs burning, body screaming inventory. I was above ground. Night had fallen. The forest was loud again, too loud. Insects shrieking, wind tearing through branches. Trees bending toward me like they were listening. My radio was silent, my watch was gone. So was my badge. I stumbled to my feet and ran until my legs buckled, until I burst out onto a service road I recognized. Headlights appeared. A truck skidded to a stop. My supervisor got out. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. They took me in, medical evaluations, psychological assessments, weeks of observation. I told them everything. They wrote it down, they filed it, they buried it under classifications I didn't have clearance to read anymore. I was medically retired, early, honorably. They said I'd been found wandering disoriented after a fall, severe concussion, stress-induced psychosis. They gave me a commendation for years of service. They told me not to go back into the woods. I don't. I live somewhere flat now, somewhere loud, somewhere the ground doesn't hum at night. But sometimes, when everything else goes quiet, I hear my own footsteps coming from somewhere behind me, matching my pace perfectly. Sometimes I hear my voice on the radio when there is no radio, and sometimes in reflections that lag just a fraction too long, I see a ranger standing still among trees that don't exist here, waiting for someone else to follow him off the trail. I thought distance would dilute it. Cities have a way of convincing you that nothing ancient can survive concrete and rebar, that whatever hunts needs trees and dark soil and places without witnesses. For a while, that lie almost worked. Traffic noise drowned out the low-frequency hum. Neon replaced starlight. People crowded close enough that my reflection was always interrupted by someone else's movement. But the forest didn't lose me. It adjusted. The first sign was the dreams. They didn't start as nightmares. They started as procedural, walking patrol routes that didn't exist anymore, checking boundary markers that had never been installed, logging reports in a handwriting that matched mine but leaned slightly to the left, like someone copying muscle memory without understanding why. In the dreams, radios worked. They always worked. Voices came through clear and calm, giving instructions that felt reasonable until I woke up and realized they made no sense at all. Directions that folded back on themselves. Orders to secure areas that weren't there. Warnings about weather events that never came. I'd wake up with my heart racing and my chest tight, convinced for several seconds that I was still underground, that the ceiling above me was layers of soil and roots pressing down. Sometimes I woke up standing. Once I woke up outside. I live on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. No balcony, no fire escape within reach. When I came to, I was barefoot in the parking lot, feet black with dirt that smelled like wet leaves and copper. I started locking my door with both deadbolts. That didn't help. I began to notice patterns during the day. Small things at first. Streetlights flickering in sequence as I walked beneath them. Pigeons going silent when I stopped moving. The hum returning, not through the ground this time, but through infrastructure. Power lines, HVAC units, elevators. The environment was learning new ways to speak. I tried therapy. I tried medication. I tried telling myself that trauma doesn't need an external trigger to keep unfolding, that the brain can turn itself into hostile terrain if given enough time and guilt. Then the calls started. Not phone calls, reports. Missing persons bulletins on local news that used phrasing too familiar to be coincidence. Last seen walking confidently, no signs of struggle. Search suspended due to environmental hazards. Once I recognized a photo, a woman in a green jacket standing at the edge of a wooded park on the outskirts of the city. Her posture was wrong in the exact same way mine had been wrong in the reflection that first day. Too still, too deliberate. I paused the screen, zoomed in. On her shoulder was a patch. Not the current design, not the one issued when I retired, an older version, discontinued. The same one I'd worn in the Bitterroots. I stopped watching the news after that. It didn't stop watching me. The dreams deepened, changed texture, became less symbolic, more instructional. I found myself memorizing layouts of places I'd never seen: storm drains that led to concrete chambers, subway maintenance tunnels that dipped too far below grade, sealed utility rooms behind municipal buildings with no official purpose. I'd wake up knowing where the doors were, knowing which ones not to open. I started losing time again, minutes at first, then hours. I'd sit down to eat and find the plate cold in front of me with no memory of cooking. I'd shower and notice dirt under my fingernails afterward. Once, I found a radio on my kitchen table, my old model, scuffed exactly where I dropped it years ago. It wasn't powered on. It was listening. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Clear weather, normal traffic, a city park crowded with joggers and parents and dogs on leashes. I was cutting through it on my way home when everything went quiet. Not the full silence from the forest. This was surgical, selective. People kept moving. Mouths kept opening and closing, but no sound reached me. The hum rose in my chest until it drowned out thought. I smelled burnt hair. The trees lining the path leaned inward, their shadows stretching too far across the pavement. For a moment, just a moment, their bark looked wrong, smooth in places, striated in others, like muscle under skin. Someone called my name. I turned. A park ranger stood behind me, same uniform style as mine, same discontinued patch, hat brim low enough to hide the eyes. "You're out of bounds," he said. I didn't ask how he knew me. I didn't ask what authority he operated under. I already knew the answers, even if I didn't want them. "I'm not going back," I said. He smiled, not with teeth, but with posture, with certainty. "You never left." The ground vibrated. I felt the pressure on my chest again, invisible and intimate, like hands settling into familiar places. The air thickened. The trees creaked, roots shifting beneath concrete they shouldn't have been able to penetrate. Around us, people walked past without noticing. Their shadows stretched toward the ranger instead of away from him. I understood then what the bunker had been for. Not containment. Transition. The forest didn't need trees. It needed access. The ranger stepped aside, gesturing toward a maintenance shed I'd passed 100 times without looking twice. Its door stood open now, darkness pooling inside it far deeper than the structure could justify. I backed away. He didn't follow. He didn't need to, because something else did. I felt it behind me. Not a presence, not a sound, but the certainty of being matched. My movements anticipated, my balance corrected before I lost it. Like the forest had finally learned me well enough to walk me forward from the inside. I'm writing this now because the dreams have stopped. That's worse. Silence again, but not the waiting kind. The resolved kind. I don't know when the door will open. I don't know which reflection will step through. I don't know if I'll be the one who keeps the forest quiet or the one who guides someone else into it. I only know this. If a ranger tells you the trail is closed, believe them. If the woods go silent around you, stop moving. And if you hear your own voice calling you from somewhere you shouldn't exist, do not answer. I didn't think there would be another section after that. That's the lie I tell myself when the room gets too quiet and the walls feel like they're listening. The truth is, part of me always knew the forest wouldn't let the story end cleanly. It never does. It doesn't conclude. It hands itself off. The dream stopped 3 weeks ago, not faded, not softened. Stopped, like a switch thrown with intent. At first, I welcomed it. Sleep without interruption felt like a gift I didn't deserve. No radios, no tunnels, no layouts burned into my head. I slept deep and blank, the kind of sleep doctors chase with prescriptions and charts. Then I realized something worse had replaced them. I was waking up rested. That should have terrified me more than it did. My body feels maintained. That's the only word that fits. Old injuries don't ache the way they used to. My shoulder, the one I shattered when I fell into the bunker, moves too smoothly now, like scar tissue that never formed. The constant tension in my chest is gone, replaced by a hollow steadiness, as if something else is carrying the weight for me. Sometimes I catch myself standing perfectly still for long stretches of time, listening to sounds I can't consciously hear. Sometimes I realize hours have passed and I don't remember deciding what to do with them. The radio is back. I don't know where it comes from. I've thrown it away twice, once into a river thick with runoff and trash, watching it sink until the surface closed over it like nothing had ever been there. It always returns to the same place, on my kitchen table, angled toward the window. It turns itself on now. No static, no distortion, just breathing. Slow, patient, deep enough that I feel it sink with my own lungs if I'm not careful. I don't respond anymore. I've learned that much. The voices don't need answers, they only need acknowledgement, and even silence can be a kind of permission if you let it linger too long. Yesterday, someone knocked on my door. I live alone, no neighbors visit, no friends still check in. The agency made sure of that without saying it outright. Distance is easier to manage than witnesses. I didn't move. The knock came again, 3 times. Precise, official. Then a voice, calm and professional, filtered through the wood. "Sir, this is Forest Service. We'd like to ask you a few questions." I closed my eyes. The voice was young, nervous, still believed in boundaries and protocols and maps that meant something. I didn't answer. The radio clicked softly behind me. The voice at the door continued, shifting tone the way they teach you to when you think someone might be in distress. Empathy layered over authority. "We're responding to a report of a missing person. You worked this area once. We were hoping you could help." I felt the hum return, not under the ground this time, but inside my skull. A gentle pressure, guiding, aligning. I knew, with sick certainty, that if I opened the door, I would know exactly what to say, where to point, which trails to recommend and which ones to casually discourage. I would sound helpful, concerned, trustworthy. I would sound like a ranger. The knock stopped. Footsteps retreated down the hall. I waited a long time after that, heart hammering, skin cold with sweat. Eventually, I risked the window. Below, in the parking lot, a green service truck idled. 2 figures stood beside it, one young, one older. The older one looked up. Even from 3 stories up, I recognized my own posture. They left together. The radio turned itself off. I'm not writing this as a plea. I don't think pleas matter once the forest has your measure. I'm writing it because I can feel the handoff approaching, the way a storm announces itself long before the first drop falls, the way animals go quiet before the ground shifts. I don't know how many versions of me there are now. I don't know which one you'd be talking to if you met me on a trail or stopped me to ask for directions or followed my voice when it called your name from somewhere it shouldn't carry. I do know this. Some of us are returned on purpose. Some of us are planted, and some of us are left behind to keep things orderly while the forest learns new ground. If you ever hear about a ranger who worked too long in one place, if you ever notice an area quietly removed from maps without explanation, if you ever step into woods that feel too attentive, too patient, pay attention to the silence. It isn't empty, it's listening. And it remembers how all of us sound when we scream. I don't leave the apartment anymore. That's not fear. Fear implies hesitation, a choice weighed and rejected. This is different. This is understanding. The same way you don't step into deep water once you realize the current has already wrapped around your legs. The forest doesn't need me to walk into it again. It's already here. The hum is constant now, not loud, not intrusive, just present. Like the electrical buzz behind walls or the pressure change before weather shifts. It follows me from room to room, strongest near the window, weakest in the bathroom where tile and pipes interrupt it just enough to breathe. I've started noticing the way buildings settle at night, the way metal contracts, the way shadows stretch across corners where there shouldn't be corners. Infrastructure is easier for it. Clean lines, hollow spaces, places meant to move people through without stopping to look. I understand now why the bunker was built where it was. Not to hide it, to teach it. The last call came this morning. The radio turned on by itself while I was making coffee. No breathing this time, no static, just a clear channel open and waiting. I almost ignored it. Almost. Unit 7, a voice said. Mine, but steadier, less frayed. We need you to confirm a boundary. I didn't answer. The voice continued anyway. There's a new access point, urban interface, high traffic, low awareness. I felt the pressure settle behind my eyes, familiar and intimate. Not forceful, encouraging. Like a hand on the small of my back, guiding me through a doorway I'd already stepped into. I saw it then, not a vision, not a hallucination. A memory forming in advance. A maintenance corridor beneath a city park. An old service hatch no one locks anymore because it's never been a problem. Concrete stairs damp with condensation, the smell of soil bleeding through sealed seams. I knew exactly how many steps it would take before the sound disappeared. I shut the radio off. For a moment, just one, the hum faltered. That's when I understood the final truth. It isn't inevitable. It's consensual. The forest doesn't conquer. It convinces. It waits until you're tired enough to accept help, until guilt erodes resistance, until routine makes obedience feel like relief. It doesn't erase you. It offers continuity. A way to keep going when stopping would mean facing everything you couldn't save. I sat down at the table and stared at my hands. They looked like mine. No stone, no bark, no wrong angles, still human, still capable of choosing to do nothing. That choice won't last forever. I can feel the edges of it thinning. Every day I resist, the pressure increases, not as punishment, but as reminder. I was good at this once. I knew the rules. I knew how to keep people safe, how to move them along paths that felt natural. The forest misses that. It misses me. This is as close as I can get to a warning. Not a moral, not advice, a record. If someone official tells you an area is closed without signage, ask yourself why. If maps update quietly, with no announcement, notice what vanished. If a ranger seems too calm, too certain, too perfectly placed to guide you when you're lost, look at their shadow. If it stretches toward the trees instead of away from them, don't follow. I don't know what will happen after this recording ends. I don't know if I'll wake up tomorrow still on this side of the handoff, or if I'll feel rested again in that wrong, maintained way. But I do know this is the last thing I'm writing as myself, because the forest doesn't need my words anymore. It already knows how I sound.